Okay, folks. Good morning, everybody. A lot of our colleagues somehow got waylaid. I think the good weather probably has made people walk a little slower this morning. But we're going to have a very good turnout here because it's a very good program. Let me welcome all of you. My name is John Hamre, and I'm the president here at CSIS, and I want to say welcome to all of you. We've been doing this for about 2 years, but when we start public events, we begin with a safety announcement. And after the tragedy in Orlando 2 days ago, it's even more important. But as I say, we've well-developed safety plans. I don't want anybody to be worried because we do have the security on presence and all that. But if we have something that comes up, I'd ask you to follow my directions. The exits are right behind me. They're over here, right here, and at that end. This door is closest to the exit that takes us down to the street. If the problem is in the back, we're going to go out front. We'll go over and meet at St. Matthew's. We have a mutual support arrangement with them. If the problem's in front, we'll go back to National Geographic. And again, they understand and anticipate that we might need that, or they may need it here. So it's something that we're doing with each other because of this very sad, tragic era that we're living through. We do have to be prepared. Nothing's going to happen, but please follow my instructions in case we do need to do something. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you. This is I think the 11th annual session that we've done with JETRO, and I'm very proud that we have partnered with JETRO. This is a premier organization in Japan and has been a marvelous partner to it, and we're very grateful for their support. It becomes the venue where we have serious conversations about the underlying economic impulse that's coursing through both the international economy and especially in Asia, and so that we collectively can understand its meaning. I think we'll probably spend a fair amount of time today talking about what's the prospects for TPP. Are we going to get TPP? We've got a campaign now where we have the presumed Republican and Democrat nominees who are opposed to TPP. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? And I think we should be talking about that. I think that'll be a very real presence. I'm unequivocally in favor of TPP. I think it is the shape of the future, and the question is, are we going to have a hand in shaping the future? That's what it's all about. And so I think to think somehow that global commerce is just going to go away and will revert to some pattern that's 30 years old if we don't pass TPP is naive. So the question is, what kind of a world do we want? And we're going to have to be partners in shaping that. So forgive me, I don't mean to get ahead of everybody here, but I don't get a chance to talk here, so I'm going to tell you what I think, I guess. But I do hope we do spend a lot of time getting into this. I think it's a very important discussion to have. I'm very, very grateful that Director Ishige is here. This is, I think, the 5th session that he's participated. It's always meaningful and very appropriate when he's here. He's been a leader in economic and trade circles in Japan for many years. He must have started as a grade school student or something. It doesn't look like he's that old, but he has rich and long experience. And he's done a splendid job of leading JETRO. He has been reappointed to take JETRO to the next level. I think we're very grateful for that. So could I ask you, with your applause, to welcome Chairman Ishige, and we look forward to his keystone comments here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us today. I would also like to give my thanks to Dr. Hamre and Dr. Green, as well as their colleagues at CSIS for their continued dedicated work on this forum. Before going into today's topic, I would like to convey our heartfelt condolences to the victims of the attack in Oran on Sunday. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and their loved ones now. The day before yesterday, I dropped in on a Chinese restaurant near CSIS called Great Wall for lunch. Do you know the name? I heard it's famous in this institute. A fortune cookie was served after our lunch. The fortune said that it is better to ask some questions than to know all the answers. And it also included the lucky number 14. Today is June 14th. What a coincidence. I believe that the fortune cookie was made on behalf of a certain institute, maybe CSIS. I have prepared another story, but to save time, I skipped that. I'm sorry for Kimura-san. He made a great effort. And today, I would like to begin with the review of development over the past year. An agreement was reached on TPP negotiations in Atlanta last October. In February this year, the signing ceremony was held in New Zealand. This agreement is rightfully recognized as a historical accomplishment for free trade. However, the TPP can only enter into force upon completion of ratification procedures in member countries. And it will be a challenge for the United States to complete these procedures in the current election season. In the meantime, joining the TPP anytime soon. On the whole, however, we can anticipate TPP membership in Asia to increase in the future. Some of these potential members are quickly growing in prominence. It will be necessary for the US and Japan to strengthen collaboration with these countries. The TPP has geopolitical significance. What is the current economic situation in Asia? The economy of China and Asia as a whole has shown signs of slowing. However, these economies are predicted to see remarkable growth soon due to the expanding middle class and the resulting growth of consumption. Countries in Asia are also developing policies to foster innovation. A critical target of such policies is the digital economy field. This field accounts for 80% of all the investment into Asian ventures. And the e-commerce transaction rule of the TPP will bolster this trend. I believe this is the key for development of e-commerce in the Asia-Pacific region. Alibaba has more than 500 million customers in China, and it is penetrating into the ASEAN markets with 600 million consumers. E-commerce in Asia will become a huge market. The issue is, what rules should be applied to this? The TPP has a great opportunity and responsibility. The TPP has already stimulated growth in Asian countries, and these very countries will soon be the engine of growth in the world. The TPP is seen as a high-level platform. But with the participation of both Malaysia and Vietnam, it is now also seen as one within reach for other countries of ASEAN. To put it bluntly, non-TPP member countries are hoping not to miss the bus. Again, the TPP has geopolitical significance. The next topic is the responsibilities of TPP member countries. What is most important now? The answer, of course, is ratification. Ratification, ratification. In order to facilitate ratification within each country, each government must work to explain why the TPP is a beneficial framework. The US and Japan have a leading role to play here. In particular, each government has to focus on supporting its SMEs and agriculture circles. It is true that some people will benefit more than others from liberalization of trade and investment. It is up to government to maximize the merits across the entire economy. Every government should provide information, educational activities, and a support structure for those persons who may be disadvantaged. While it may be a sensitive topic, in the midst of US presidential election, we have seen a backlash against trade liberalization, anti-trade sentiment. To address these concerns, I believe the US government and Congress need to explain that the benefits will surpass the disadvantages. The benefits can be enjoyed by even small and medium-sized enterprises. Broad support for the TPP is needed. This is the key for ratifying the TPP treaty. On this topic, we at JETRO have held more than 100 TPP seminars for Japanese companies since just after the conclusion of TPP negotiations. We will hold an additional 150 seminars this fiscal year. We also provide information relevant to Japanese companies through a special website on TPP. There are about 3.8 million SMEs in Japan, and many of these SMEs possess advanced technologies in spite of their small scale. We want these SMEs to gain the maximum benefit from the floor. Incidentally, how is an SME defined in Japan? Mr. Kuroda? It's 300 or fewer employees. In the US, it is 500. How about in China? Is there anyone who knows the answer? Dr. Lee? No. 3,000 or fewer. China has a huge population, so the definition of SMEs is also a big number. By the way, Yokota-san is quite familiar with that. He used to be the DG of the agency for SMEs in Japan. Anyway, to go back on track, the support SMEs need spans from product development to the development of sales channel. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry launched a consortium to provide such comprehensive support to SMEs. JETRO is the implementing agency for the consortium. We will coordinate more than 700 government-related organizations and local support organizations, such as banks and chambers of commerce and industry. Over the next 2 years, JETRO will also dispatch 400 experts in support of the overseas expansion of 4,000 Japanese companies. In addition to SMEs, we have also started promoting the export of agriculture and fishery products from Japan to the world. This slide shows a part of JETRO's effort to do so. This is a new area, new activity. One successful case is that peaches produced in Fukushima, that's peach. JETRO invited buyers from Thailand and showed them the processes for production and inspection. The buyers are satisfied with all the processes. As a result, it was decided that Fukushima peaches would be exported to Thailand and were even presented to the Thai royal family. These efforts were intended to change the mindset that the export of agriculture products from Japan is impossible. By the way, do you like Japanese cuisine? Please raise your hand if you do. Not many. Very disappointed. According to my notes, it said great. It's difficult, unpredictable. After the implementation of the TPP, you will be able to enjoy Japanese wagyu, sake, as well as delicious fruits at more reasonable prices here in Washington. So TPP is quite important. These activities conducted by the Japanese government have been praised overseas, including by U.S. Ambassador Kennedy. Kennedy's son is there. It's a little bit dark, so difficult to see. The Malaysian Trade Minister Mustafa. On the U.S. side, the United States Trade Authority publicized the merits of the TPP for various types of companies and for each state. The information is very clear and I believe effective in promoting the advantages of the agreement. The next topic, final topic, is future challenges beyond the TPP. What do we do after the TPP? It might be a little too early to discuss, but very, very important. The TPP has had a dramatic effect on other FTAs, such as the TTIP, Japan-EU FTA, and RCEP. In Asia, RCEP is targeted to be agreed upon within the year. On this topic, I would like to ask a question as a catalyst for the following panel discussion. If and when RCEP comes into effect, in what ways will we see trade liberalization through the region become integrated? Or alternatively, will we not see any integration at all? Some experts advocate forming the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific or FTAP through unifying the TPP and RCEP. However, this may be a big challenge. From a historical point of view, no such large-scale free trade agreements have ever been successfully merged. In Europe, two trade frameworks have coexisted since the 1960s, as this chart shows, namely the EFTA and the EC. But today, the number of members countries of EFTA has decreased to only 4: Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Economic integration of European countries lies with the EU. At this moment, what scenarios would be possible for the Asia-Pacific? I see two likely possibilities. The first scenario is that the TPP and RCEP will coexist separately. What would happen in this case? The so-called spaghetti ball phenomenon would occur. Complication arising from application of the different rules of the TPP and RCEP may have a negative effect on business across borders. How could we overcome this problem? That's a big challenge. The other scenario is that a competition will arise between the TPP and RCEP regarding cohesive power, namely competition in drawing member countries out from the other. I will not assume that unification will be brought by a lower-level agreement. Rather, I see the more advanced TPP, which has come along first, as attracting a greater number of countries. China and India, for example, in particular China. This is the second largest country in the world in terms of GDP. We should welcome the accession of China to the TPP in the future if it fully satisfies the criteria of the TPP. This accession would be useful for China to conduct reforms of state-owned enterprises. In this regard, I would also like to hear comments regarding the relationship between the TPP and the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative promoted by the Chinese government. Anyhow, I would like to ask each panelist about this point later. Japan was aiming at the ratification of the TPP in the Diet this spring. However, this has been delayed due in part to the recent earthquake in Kumamoto. I expect that it will be approved at a future Diet session as quickly as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, how long has it taken for the US and Japan, as well as 10 other countries, to reach this goal? How many persons have been involved throughout the process? How difficult bedrock regulations have been tackled in spite of huge domestic political pressure? These tough negotiations have been led by the United States and Japan. All TPP members have expressed strong appreciation for the results of their negotiations. The United States and Japan should continue to show strong leadership until all ratification have been completed. Do you think this is an achievement that could ever be reproduced? I personally doubt it. If we fail in ratifying this treaty at the moment, what will happen? All the TPP members would be disappointed, discouraged. Then a pivot from the United States might occur. No high-level platform will be made toward the economic integration within the Asia-Pacific region. Then who will write the trade and investment rules governing the Asia-Pacific region? It is obvious, and this brings me to final thought. The US and Japan have both taken leadership roles in reaching the current agreement on the TPP. The TPP is a miracle, I think. It had been regarded as impossible in Japan until just 3 years ago. What is necessary now is for both of our countries, as well as all other participant countries, to quickly ratify it and put it into effect. All 12 member countries share the responsibility for ratifying and implementing the TPP treaty. I would like to conclude my remarks by wishing for this seminar a great success. Thank you very much.
Ishige-san, thank you. As always, you've opened our annual conference on economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region and the United States and Japan's role with witty and perceptive and helpful observations. I think your caution that an American failure to ratify TPP risks Asia pivoting away from the U.S., and my only regret was I think we should have had you speak right before lunch, because all of your references to Japanese cuisine and I was going to say one belt, one road, one province, one product have already made me hungry for lunch. We will serve lunch today. Our plan is to spend the morning with our 4 distinguished experts. We'll take a brief coffee break, then continue that discussion. And then at lunch, we have a distinguished speaker, the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Bruce Andrews. And we'll have plenty of time for your questions, and we may do some informal polling of the audience using our high-tech paper voting mechanism. This conference on Asia-Pacific economic integration and the role of the U.S. and Japan makes sense to us in a lot of ways. We were very pleased to begin convening these with JETRO over a decade ago, or about a decade ago, and for a number of reasons. First of all, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1960 in Article 2 highlights economic cooperation, and for the decades after the end of the war and the first decades of the Cold War, it was the U.S. government's hope that Japan's economic recovery and growth would fuel the economic recovery, growth, and integration of the rest of Asia, of Southeast Asia and Korea in particular. Then, of course, critical in China's reintegration in the regional and global economy in the 1970s and 80s. In some ways, Japan did too well from the perspective of many Americans. And in the 80s and 90s, I think if we'd held this conference, the discussion would have been, how can the U.S. Stop Japan from creating an alternate institutional architecture in Asia with pernicious schemes like the Asia Monetary Fund? Some of you aren't old enough to remember that. Some of you are old enough to have forgotten it. But that was in the late 90s, a sort of alternative proposal to the IMF. There were many dissertations and books written about the evil scheme of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry to use foreign aid and high values of the yen to create keiretsu infrastructure in Southeast Asia and push out the United States. So if we'd done this about 15, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the conference would have been all about U.S.-Japan friction. And today, it's almost 99% about how the U.S. and Japan converge and have an interest in creating a regional architecture that promotes transparency, growth, and rules. And we have some friction today with China, and there's some debates that China's trying to create an alternate architecture, an alternate set of institutions. The historical circumstances are different from Japan and the US in the 1980s and 90s. But I think one of the key assumptions for a lot of us in this conference is that free trade agreements are not like alliances or treaties. They're competitive, but they're not designed to be containing or weakening other countries. I think all of us subscribe to the theory of competitive trade liberalization, that when obstacles to trade, not just tariffs, but behind-the-border obstructions are removed, and countries involved in that negotiation trade and invest more, that other countries are going to want to get in that. So they'll lower their barriers, maybe with other countries at first, and then merging over time. So this competitiveness in trade negotiations and the different acronyms from TPP to RCEP to CJK, the China-Japan-Korea trilateral discussions, to FTAP, Free Trade of the Asia-Pacific, or Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, agreed to in 2007 at APEC, another acronym, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, that all of these are not mutually exclusive in the long run. But as Ishige pointed out, the mechanics of how you merge them historically has been very complicated. So that's one of the things that we'll want to talk about. We also use this conference to do a kind of checkup on the politics of trade and the politics of institutional architecture. And I think the politics, certainly in the U.S., have become complicated this time. We'll be interested in hearing, as Ishige-san pointed out, how the TPP debate here is resonating in China and Japan and Vietnam and the region more broadly. And also how the politics are going in Japan, which put off its ratification from the spring to the fall, or in Vietnam or other countries, and in China in particular, which has, I think, an important debate about what TPP means for China's economy in the future. The mood on trade is a little bit down in Washington these days. There's a lot of sort of bad things happening this week in American news. But people who are advocates of trade are generally feeling a little bit off the past few weeks because our two leading candidates have declared in different ways their opposition to TPP. But Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, we're 14-0 for free trade agreements over the last 2-3 decades. Somehow we managed to pull it off. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Shakespeare in Love. There's a great scene in that movie where the owner of the Globe, of the theater that performs Shakespeare's plays, he has no play, he has no actors. Shakespeare is missing, and his creditors are hanging him upside down, poking him with hot irons, saying, "You owe us money." And he said, "I'll pay you when the play starts." And they said, "You have no actors, you have no play, Shakespeare is missing, how will you do it?" And he says, "I don't know, we always do it." "How?" And he says, "I don't know, it's a miracle." Our trade politics have been like that. I was in the White House for the U.S., Australia, U.S., Singapore, and Chorus free trade agreements. Those were a lot tougher than people remember. And similarly, NAFTA and other trade agreements, it's always a near-run thing. It's a lot tougher in the current political environment, but I think we should not give up on a miracle. And we'll see if people think that's too optimistic. So our panel for the morning includes 4 distinguished economists and economic policymakers. We'll turn first to Dr. Li Xiangyang, the Director General of the National Institute of International Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And Dr. Li is going to talk in particular about OBOR, One Belt, One Road. And my most important mission is to find out whether we should be calling it Belt and Road, One Belt, One Road, OBOR, and we'll find out today, and also what it means for this larger question of infrastructure, investment, institution building in Asia. And then we'll turn next to Yasuhiko, editorial writer for the NIKKEI Shimbun. Ota-san's a veteran economics reporter. He was here in Washington, reports from Singapore. He's the host of a show that I've seen that's been on for a long time called Zhipang. And he'll be talking about some of the larger trends in Asian political economy and society, and the question of whether TPP is, never mind that it's too hard, is it even big enough given the huge changes we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific region? We'll turn next to Vo Chin Than, PhD from ANU, Australian National University in Canberra, in economics. He is from the Central Institute for Economic Management of Vietnam, and will talk to us about how Vietnam's three-decade work on the so-called Doi Moi reforms relates to the larger mix of free trade negotiations Vietnam's involved with, from the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement to TPP to RCEP. Vietnam's in most of them. And finally, we turn to Matt Goodman, the William E. Simon Chair in Political Economy and Senior Advisor for Asian Economics at CSIS, former Bush and Obama administration NSC official and State Department official, and the guy at CSIS who tracks all of this very closely for comment. So with that, let me turn it over next to Professor Lee for your presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a very pleasure, a great pleasure to speak at the conference on the Asia-Pacific economic integration. I wish to thank JETRO to invite me to share my view on this. Because China, up to now, China is excluded from the TPP, so my topic is on OBOR. Compare with the established RTA, for example, TPP dominated by US, the OBOR proposed by China is a new type of regional economic cooperation mechanism and has its own governance and architecture. At the same time, there are much misunderstandings and skepticism, such as the Chinese version of Marshall Plan, the tribute system in the new area, near colonialism, and so on. As a result, it's imperative to make comparison between the OBOR and the existing FTA, such as TPP, and to discuss its implications for the regional economic integration in Asia. In this section, I want to touch three issues. In first issue, I will discuss OBOR orientations. As an international initiative, OBOR orientations has to share the common interest of China and the nearby countries. Based on the principle, OBOR have four orientations at least. First one is important foundation of China's neighboring strategy in new area. It's a precondition for China's peaceful rise to build a stable and a good neighbor environment. 3 days ago, President Xi laid out a serious new idea, such as 亲诚惠容, that means closeness, earnestness, benefit, inclusiveness. However, it's not easy to put idea into practice. In this context, OBOR is an important means that services the neighboring strategy. The second orientation is a new platform of economic diplomacy. As you know, that diplomacy service for economy has been considered as a basic principle in China. However, the new Chinese leader recently stressed economic diplomacy. In international academic circle, the concept is not new. In practice, it mainly falls into two categories: diplomatic activities taking economy as means and as ends. So OBOR will act as the new platform of economic diplomacy. The second orientation is most important route for new round of opening up. For a long time, Chinese opening up has focused on the southeast coast area, and in its other area has been neglected. In OBOR framework, the Maritime Silk Road serves its opening up in East Coast area, and the Silk Road economic belt will serve its opening up in its central and western regions. At the same time, the scope of opening up will extend from trade to going out, from economic cooperation to all-round cooperation. The last orientation is a new approach to promote global trade liberalization as a regional economic cooperation mechanism. The rationale of OBOR depends on whether it's building block or stumbling block for multilateral trade system. Due to its openness and development-oriented, OBOR will become an important public goods China provides to Asia and world. Turning my second issue, OBOR characteristics of as a new type of regional economic cooperation mechanism. Compared with TPP, OBOR is developed-oriented rather than rule-based one as TPP. The first, it inherits the carrier forward the concept of cooperation and the development of Asian Silk Road. For a long time, the Asian Silk Road has been China's commercial tie with outside world. Now, Chinese leaders hope to revive the concept and connect China with nearby countries, forming a regional economic cooperation mechanism. Second, it will be built on the basis of connectivity. For most of RTAs, connectivity is not their precondition. However, in the most of Asian emerging economies, poor infrastructure is very popular, which constitutes an important bottleneck for global value chain because of tariff rate is low for most products, especially for the intermediate goods. Thus, the connectivity is precondition of global value chain. The third is multiple cooperation mechanisms adapt to diversity of development paths in Asia, the diversity of regional economy and politics and difficulties stemming from historical and political baggage among them has shaped the nature of economic cooperation in Asia. OBOR consists of various cooperation mechanisms: FTA, sub-regional economic cooperation, economic corridor, industrial park, technology park, capacity, export, etc. The last, it aims to achieve a common community of interest, responsibility, and fit. So we can give the OBOR definition, a new regional economic cooperation mechanism connected by transport route based on connectivity and furthering diversified cooperation for community of shared destiny. My final and most important topic is OBOR implication for economic integration in Asia. Owing to its openness, OBOR will adopt every applicant along the Silk Road, so it wouldn't result in separation in Asia. In contrast, TPP's accession conditionality is much stricter than OBOR. The accession conditionality is showed as de facto rather than de jure. Thus, TPP may result in split in ASEAN, APEC, or CIP, and or marginalization of some developing countries in Asia economic integration. Second, based on this connectivity, OBOR would promote global value chain as well as trade and investment liberalization in Asia. Not long ago, a study by World Economic Forum found that supply chain barriers to international trade are far more significant impediment to trade than tariff. Reducing supply chain barriers could increase world GDP over 6 times more than removing all tariffs. The third, due to its multiple cooperation mechanism, OBOR won't bring about substitution effect on established RTA. For example, RCEP, ACE, even TPP. Some analyses tend to characterize the TPP and OBOR as reflecting confrontation or competition between the United States and China for hegemony in Asia, but this seems to be an oversimplification. In addition, if we have time, we will discuss the China's opposition for TPP. Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Dr. Duvall? They sat you in the different order from the program. So sorry, Ota-san.
Okay, I should go. So my name is Yasuhiko with NIKKEI newspaper. I used to live in Washington a long time ago when Mr. Clinton was in the White House, and I missed the air of this town. They're really relaxing, I think. But at the moment, it's very tense, of course, because of the election. I am just a journalist, which means I'm not a businessman, I'm not a policymaker or negotiator. What I do, my job is to go after the policymakers and the government officials and the business people. So I was just wondering if I think I would be, it might be useful for you to share my view, how I view the TPP, because I followed the TPP from the very beginning, even before the U.S. has joined the negotiation. It's around, the idea has floating around in Asia around 2000. Then Singapore and Brunei and Chile and New Zealand has initiated the negotiation, and the Bush administration jumped in. And at the time I was in Washington, and I wasn't really aware of the nature of this initiative, but now I understand it's very in a different way. And I moved to Singapore from Tokyo last year, and I have lived in Singapore for 1 year. And when I was in Tokyo, the TPP is more like U.S.-Japan free trade zone. It's FTA, because about the 2/3 of GDP in the region, or I think the membership, the total of the GDP of the member states of the TPP is occupied by the U.S. and Japan. So it's the people tend to see TPP as FTA, bilateral agreement with the U.S. But after having moved to Singapore, I have totally different pictures. That is this. The red line is something called 9-dashed line. It's drawn by the China. China claims it's inside of this line is the Chinese territory. And the blue one is inside TPP. It's a group of TPP. Now, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, only Singapore Singapore and Brunei is only a small dot. So basically, it's Vietnam and Malaysia when it comes to the space. And the Philippines is raising their hand and studying hard and what benefit for them to. And Indonesia has shown Mr. President Joko, when he was here last year, he announced his own original intention to join, to consider joining the TPP. And Thailand has already started the conversation with the US and the other counterparts if it is useful for them to join the TPP. So it might be a bigger picture, but at this moment, TPP is this. So this is not really large enough. And 9 dashed line is within that line is the territory of China. I don't know, it's maybe far in thousands years ago, it may be the case, but it is not really. And also, its dashed line cannot really define the territory. So there's a lot of holes, so nobody knows what's going to happen next. So there's a tension. And looking at the region from Singapore, the people are quite nervous. What might happen? How can we keep the stability and the peace in this region? TPP is about trade and investment and the economy, and the South China Sea tension is more like military and the power balance things, but it's related from my point of view. Historical and traditional conventional wisdom tells that it's better to separate national security issue and trade issue. But nowadays, I think it's related to each other because interreliance is quite important to keep the stability in the region. If you have a friend in a neighbor country and you have a free trade agreement with them, and your industry, the whole business and economy really relies on your neighbors. You cannot really attack them. So you got to be nice and you got to be amicable to the neighbors. So that way, I think somewhat we can keep the peace and orders in the region. That's my observation, and that's how Singapore looks at the region. So Singapore is trying to keep the same distance with the China and Japan and US and trying to make a balance. But this balance is really delicate, so we have to handle with care. Okay, so that's my observation. I saw a guy called Mr. Alec Ross. She was advisor to Mrs. Clinton when she was in the State Department. The title was, I forgot, something like advisor of innovation. And we had an interesting conversation with Mr. Alec Ross about the data. The meaning of the significance of this region. It's not just about trade. This is supposed to be the center of the economic growth of the world, but also it is a place where the information is being created. So he said, I think it is quite an interesting metaphor. The raw materials in the agricultural age is the land, and the raw material in industrial age is steel. The raw material in information age is data. And I found, then I went to the Facebook company, and they have the offices in Singapore, and they say the account they have in Facebook as more than 25% is from Asian Pacific, and only 15 is from North America, and 20 in the EU. And also, I went to the Cisco, the American internet company, and they have a huge headquarters in Singapore, and they are trying to connect all the networks in this region. So this is a place where the raw materials are being produced. So somewhat we have to have this playing field market here and the rule-oriented order in an economy. So I think the TPP works in that way, and that's why this is not big enough. And also, what's significant for Japan particularly is Thailand. Thai is outside of the blue line, but it is a center. Bangkok is a center of the supply chain of materials, particularly in the auto industry for Japanese manufacturers. And this is very important to include Thai and that Mekong region. Only Vietnam is inside the blue line. The other things I want to share with you, my observation, is this one, how can I put this one? Right, yes. Asia, Southeast Asia is supposed to be the center of the growth of the economy in the world. Yes, it is growing. But China is slowing down, and Japan is still stagnating. And the U.S. is trying to get, now have a rate hike of the interest rate. So a lot of things are happening. But one thing we cannot miss is the move of the people and demography. Asia is aging so rapidly, and beyond the imagination we have. Everybody knows that Japan is an aging society, and China is more like the same. But Thai is as bad as Japan. Look at this picture. The left side is a very beautiful pyramid type. But the more people in the younger generation support the less number of the elderly people, very stable. And currently it is like this, fat. Its middle chunk is around 40, 50 years old. It is the biggest part of the population. And they are moving up. In 20 years or 30 years, it's going to be exploded like a mushroom. So it's very unstable. So what's happening in Thailand is this. People moves. The image of a border in the United States and the EU is somewhat very strict. And whenever you come to America to pass the passport control, and you may have some, you are American citizens, but we have some experience to come in here. So they are not so friendly, aren't they? I mean, they ask a nasty question, why you come here, what do you bring in, border is a strict thing. And I don't really like that the whole the scenario I have seen on TV last year in the EU. A lot of immigrants and refugees is flocking into the high-rising wall and the bloody palm and shouting, and that they are blocking, and the gate is closed. So this is the shape and the image of border. But in Mekong, it's different. I had a chance to interview two immigrants from Myanmar to Thailand, around the Bangkok area. So I asked them, what does the border mean for you? Border? Well, nothing. It's just drawn by some British guys a couple of years, 100 years ago. Mon is one of the minority tribes in Myanmar. Myanmar has over 150 official minority tribes. It's defined in their constitution, and they have given a right. But still, they are minorities. They are not really quite happy to live in Myanmar. So the rate is 3 times higher in Thailand. So naturally they come to Bangkok area to find a job. And I asked him, what is the border for you? So border is nothing. He said he ride a bike on the weekend and go to see his sister and come back. Border is like that. It's obscure. This is the way how it is in the Mekong. And neighboring country of Thailand is Myanmar and Laos, Cambodia. And I found over 1 million of people from Myanmar comes into Thailand. It's that official number, so it's probably the number is more 3 times bigger than that. And the number of the refugees and migrants in Europe last year was 1 million. So it's an even more significant, larger scale of move of people is taking place in Mekong. This is something quite dynamic, so we have to take a look at it. And so what happened is here, as a green line is Thailand. This is an absolute number of migrants foreign people living in the country. And Japan is declining. So this is not it's a percentage of the whole population. This is the absolute number. Japan is 3 times larger than, I think 2 times larger than Thai. And Hong Kong, Singapore has historically accepted a lot of migrants and the foreign workers, but now it's kind of stable. But Thai became a center of migration in Mekong. And So that's why this is quite important. The Thai is the center of the supply chain and also the center of the migration. So probably we have to take more, significantly to look at this area. They are still outside of this TPP regime. So TPP is not just about Japan and the US on trade and investment. This is about rule. So obscurity may be a conflicting concept of rule-oriented, but sometimes it's quite important in Asia. And dashed line is obscure idea. And I think the Professor Lee's the explanation on One Belt, One Way, One World is very, very well calculated and designed scheme. I picked up some keywords in his speech. It's connectivity and cooperation and community. This is important. So ASEAN is supposed to be a community, and it was core of everything. It's RCEP, but TPP can be seen as a dividing line of ASEAN. There is a separation outside TPP, inside TPP. And because the Thai, Philippines, Indonesia has announced their intention to join TPP because the bus is moving, so they don't want to miss the bus. But the bus stuck here, and probably engine is still idling, but it doesn't seem to be moving ahead. So this is a big challenge for Japan and the US in terms of the foreign policy as well as business strategy, how we can include them with the group, into the group, to have to share the same rule and a flat field market and free move of data. So this is if the US and Japan fail to ratify the TPP, it's not just a disappointment, but it's going to be a distrust. So we have to think of it. I will stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Because of Thai constraints, so I just pick up 2 points. Number one, that's related to Vietnam. Why Vietnam joined many FTAs, including TPP and Vietnam EU FTAs, high FTAs, quite high standard. And the second point, I just try to mention about how we think about the regional integration. So basically in Asia Pacific, you can observe 2 tracks of integration. One is very much based on ASEAN and ASEAN Plus, right? ASEAN Plus 1 and now ASEAN Plus 6, RCEP, RCEP. And second track, there's a TPP, right? So how we think about that. So that's 2 points. Okay, the first point, Vietnam now joined 16 FTAs, right? Even some policymakers in Vietnam, they don't remember which FTA we have now, right? Too many. And, there's paradox, a little bit paradox, because even now, Vietnam not yet recognized by US and EU as market economy. But we joined the 2 high standard FTAs, TPP and Vietnam EU FTAs, very market FTAs, like that. Now the second paradox is Vietnam is the lowest income country among the members of the TPP, right? So how we can have capability, capacity to, implement, to comply with commitment like that. Why? Okay, that's a complicated, explanation. But at the end, I will give you a very simple reason why we joined the TPP and other FTAs. We expect the expansion of export, but not just export, but also other economic, activities. because TPP and Vietnam EU not just dealing with trade, but also many, regulation behind the border related to other activities. And trade now, very much associated with the value chain, production network. So you can talk about other activities rather than just export. And the second one, we try to make Vietnam to be very attractive to foreign investment, right? If you play the game with Vietnam now, you can utilize not just our market with the 90 million people, with the emerging middle class, but also you can, exploit the major market in the world, because we have FTA with the major market in the world, right? ASEAN, ASEAN Plus, and then Russia, EU, US, and many other TPP members, right? And most important, we think TPP and Vietnam-EU FTAs as a kind of catalyst pressure for the domestic reform. As I already mentioned, TPP and Vietnam-EU, there's a lot about the regulation behind the border, e-commerce, state-owned enterprises, regulation, procurement, IPRs, labor, environmental standards. So that's about domestic reform. That's about institutional reform, right? And no secret, also geopolitical consideration also important for Vietnam as a small economy, And we understand the cost we have to pay, right? Adjustment costs, some losers, compliance costs, especially as I mentioned, we have very weak capability. But in general, we think TPP, Vietnam, EU FTAs, and other FTAs, that's very consistent with the way we try to reform our economy. We try to have the new way of development, not just based on comparative advantage, based on natural resources, but started to be based on innovation, higher productivity, right? And interestingly, not wait, for ratification. During the process of negotiation, business community, investor, they try to already take advantage of the TPP and Vietnam EU. Over the last few years, billion US dollar already invest just in textile garment industry in Vietnam to take advantage of Yan Forward rule of origin, right? Come from China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, basically. Not say about electronics like Samsung, Vietnam already, global base for the Samsung production of the smartphone. And US, right, ambassador to Vietnam, he said with the confidence in the near future, US will become #1 investor in Vietnam. Even now, in US just #8 investor, right? Top 4 there's Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. But in near future, US #1. So they try to take advantage of the TPP and other FTAs Vietnam join. And not just business. Our government already tried to reform, over the last 5 years. We try to restructure of the SOE, state-owned enterprises. We try to improve our legal framework. We already amended the law of enterprise and the law of investment. In Vietnam now, no distinction between the law for domestic investor, for FDI, for the SOE, for the private enterprise, all in one, law, right? And a business environment. Within 2 years, we try to achieve the average of the ASEAN 3, the best performance in terms of business environment, like average of Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. That's we try to do. But the key thing is already TPP and other FTAs already affected our institution, affected our, the way of doing business. Okay, if you look at that, AEC, ASEAN Economic Community, ASEAN Plus One, TPP, Vietnam, AU, FTAs, RCEP, they have a huge impact on ASEAN and on Vietnam, right? And some people say Vietnam the most benefit from the TPP. I'm not sure about that. But one thing we have to remember, don't believe the modeling, right? Whatever they use as CZ or ZTAP model. The thing is, according to our experience, right, on the estimation using the general equilibrium, underestimate the impact of the integration. The reason is that they do not take into account the full, the change behind the border changes, domestic reform, right, institutional reform. So that's very much depends on how we look at the integration, how we try to, comply with the commitment, how we try to reform your economy, okay? Now, the second point, what we think about AEC, ASEAN Economic Community, and ASEAN Plus One or RCEP. Many think AEC just like FTA, trade liberalization. Yes, AEC is about liberalization of trade, investment, services. But more than that, AEC is a paradigm of the cooperation and integration of developing countries. We not just emphasize on liberalization, production-based, single market, but we also focus on cooperation, connectivity, and we continue to be open regionalism. Why is that? Because liberalization just opportunities, right? How people can access to the opportunity with the lower transaction cost, how they can exploit the new choices, new opportunities. So we need connectivity, we need facilitation, we need the cooperation to improve the capability, particularly for the low-income country like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, right? So that's why AEC is a kind of paradigm of cooperation, integration, liberalization, cooperation, connectivity, and that's a process, right? AEC is not just in by the last year, but that's process. So the leader, they have vision for the AEC beyond 2015, right? Focusing more on innovation, green growth, inclusiveness, and other things, right? Okay. What the problem, AEC and RCEP? Of course, spaghetti bow, rule of origin, complexity, that's of course one with many FTAs if you have. And the second, there's ASEAN centrality, right? How ASEAN can play the role as a driving force for RCEP negotiation, Japan, China, ASEAN, that's one. Other problem, there's institution, enforcement, implementation. ASEAN Secretariat is just coordinator, quite weak in terms of enforcement, right? And last but not least, already some people mentioned non-traditional security issues, right? Trafficking, smuggling, on other things. That's the key issues for the AEC and also maybe RCEP. Okay, RCEP and TPP, to the mega FTAs. We think there's a similarities, many, and differences. But that's about the liberalization of investment, trade, services, but commitment to be, open, to follow open regionalism, right? Anyone can join. And, but RCEP and TPP so different, right? RCEP are very much based on the AEC paradigm, right? Liberalization, cooperation, connectivity, yeah. But, TPP, there's more rule-based, FTA, commitment, arrangement. RCEP is, try to be driven by ASEAN centrality, right? But TPP very much driven by US, right? Regulation, the rules of game for negotiation. And for those, standard, high quality under the TPP, yes, RCEP and AEC also take into account, but for cooperation, not like rules of game, not like a commitment. And the last but not least, RCEP is about process, right? For example, by the end of this year, RCEP can be concluded, according to the target set by the policymaker. We need to negotiate, finish by the end of this year. But, that does not mean the end for negotiation for RCEP continue to be like, AEC. But TPP, there's a single undertaking, you sign, you ratify, you implement. Of course, a consultation, cooperation somehow, but basically there's a single undertaking. Okay, the last my slide. What we think there's conversion to FTAAP, coexistence or integration. I think there's more complementary between RCEP TPP rather than contradictory, right? Both about the liberalization, both encourage trade and investment in the region. And, if you widen the participation, the gain bigger. That's, theory. And whatever the case, two templates, very important. In the future, if you would like to have a kind of arrangement for Asia Pacific, you need to take into account the new issues, new dimension of trade in the 21st century behind the border regulation. At the same time, you need to take into account diversity in the region, level of development, differences in institution setting. So cooperation, that's a kind we also need, and connectivity. So, in that sense, both complementary. But the risk quite high, geopolitical issues, South China Sea, that's no secret. Other issues like, TPP and RCEP can have trade diversion effect. For example, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, not yet member of TPP. And according to many estimations, TPP can have diversion trade investment effect. So that's negative on other non-members. So, the gap between development can be widened. So that's kind of risk. And last, I already mentioned there's ASEAN centrality. Even whatever the case, we need to support that one, ASEAN centrality, given the very specific, salient feature of the Asia Pacific. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I always enjoy this conference, and I think this is the third or fourth time I've done it. Maybe I even participated before I came to CSIS, and I think it's always a really terrific, stimulating conversation. I always learn a lot from the speakers, and did again today. But I do have to admit that, regional economic integration is not for everyone. It is a lot of syllables there, and it's not for necessarily the most exciting topic for everyone, so it's delightful to see such a big crowd here. Mike and I have had the pleasure of working for presidents who, going back to the first APEC summit in '93, although I didn't work in this context for that president, but Mike and I have had to convince presidents to fly halfway across the world for a couple of days to sit around with other leaders to talk about regional economic integration and to put on a silly shirt. And that part in particular is very challenging. But what's interesting is that when you actually get them out there, having resisted all of this and even going, they always find it, in my experience, they've always found it very stimulating and rewarding. And I think they are captured by the sort of energy of the region and the shared concerns, the shared challenges that all leaders are facing in the region, and the desire for more, community. I was, listening to all of these presentations. I was struck by all the C words that we heard: cooperation and community and connectivity. And I think those are all very powerful forces in the Asia Pacific. And as I say, I think certainly American leaders or other participants from the U.S. who participate in these debates pick up on all of those things and believe that's what this is all about. But I would also add another C to this conversation, which is also implicit or even explicit in some of the presentations, which is competition. There is an element of competition here that you hear throughout these presentations. And, you know, trained as an economist, I don't have a problem with competition. In this building, often the word competition is seen as a sort of dirty word because it implies zero-sum struggles for advantage. But actually, in economics, it's a good thing. It brings out the best in people if they're trying to get better. And you feel that in this debate, that there is a lot of elements of positive competition here. Whether it's in the origins of TPP itself, which even outside the Asia Pacific, I think was partly designed to create a broader global competitive dynamic because the WTO negotiations had stalled, and I think there was an effort, part of the motivation for TPP was to get those international multilateral negotiations going. It's obviously present in the debate between TPP and RCEP and other trade arrangements. You see competition in Vietnam's approach to Doi Moi and to TPP. They want to get more competitive, and they feel the pressure of competition and are responding positively to that. You saw it taking from Vietnam to Indonesia. I mean, look at the president of Indonesia was here in Washington for about 15 minutes a couple of months ago because he had to rush back to deal with the fires there. And 12 of those 15 minutes in the Oval Office he spent trying to make the case for Indonesia joining TPP. I mean, extraordinary. And I think that was due to the fact that Vietnam is in this agreement that was reached. And Indonesia doesn't want to lose a competitive position to Vietnam in attracting foreign investment and so forth. That's a good thing. And the discussion of One Belt, One Road as well. I usually try to resist the notion of One Belt, One Road being some sort of counterpoint to TPP. But the way Dr. Lee presented it, I can see that these are sort of competitive approaches to the broader themes that we're talking about here of connectivity. Though I don't think it's zero-sum at all. Again, I think there's a very positive dimension to all of these things. So I just want to, I think we have to realistically acknowledge that there is a competitive element here, and I think that's a good thing, and that's what certainly from a U.S. perspective we embrace. And I think it explains why the Asia-Pacific region is still, despite everything, the world's most dynamic region. It's going to account for 2/3 of global growth this year. Even a slower trajectory of global growth and a slower trajectory of Asian growth, there's still going to be 2/3 of the world's growth is going to come from this region. And integration and the competitive dynamics behind that, I think, are a large part of that. So that's sort of my overall takeaway. I lost my voting sticker. This is a matter of pride for a DC resident that we actually get to vote on something, even if it's meaningless. In any event, so let me just say a couple of words about TPP and One Belt, One Road, picking up on the presentations. TPP is designed, of course, to, let's just remind ourselves what it's about. It's about promoting regional economic integration through market opening and through rules, through new, updated, strengthened rules that deal with the realities of 21st century economic integration, which are not about arm's length trade described by Ricardo 200 plus years ago, but are about value chains. And in a value chain world, there are a lot of frictions along the economic value chain, and you need to have rules that address all of those frictions and try to create disciplines along that lane. And that's really what TPP is about. It is, just responding to a point that Dr. Lee said, it's not an exclusionary, there's an implication that it's sort of, you addressed it as well, that somehow some people are not included in it. TPP is an open architecture. It's explicitly an a part of APEC and APEC's vision of a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. It's open to all APEC members who aspire to achieve its high standards. And actually, APEC is a pretty porous organization. Even if in membership it's got a moratorium on new members. I mean, the reality is if other members of the broadly defined Asia-Pacific region wanted to join TPP, I don't see any reason why it's beyond the ability of people to figure out how to make that happen. So there's no rule against other members. And then I think I just want to stress one other basic point, and then I'll give my own prognostication about TPP. The other important thing at a conference like this is to stress how, first of all, the United States and Japan's role in bringing about TPP. Without the U.S. and Japan committed to this agreement, it would not have happened. And in fact, when I worked for Mike Froman a few years ago when he was still in the White House, he saw the possibility of Japan joining in a way that I didn't. He understood that having Japan in the room on our side of the table, not on the old issues, he knew there were going to be problems on agriculture and automobiles and so forth, but on all the other issues, the rules-related issues, I think Froman saw, 5 years ago that having Japan on this side of the table would allow us to get this agreement done, and he was right, and lo and behold, we got an agreement. It's also important to remember this is like incredible in U.S.-Japan terms. I mean, we sort of breeze by this and take it for granted. But as Mike said at the beginning, when he and I started out, and we both did internships at USTR in the bad old days in the late 1980s, the U.S.-Japan relationship was all about managing friction, or maybe even expanding friction in some points. But this is completely the opposite of this. I mean, we have come together and reached this agreement. It was unthinkable, certainly 25 years ago, but even probably 5 or 6 years ago, this was unthinkable. And so it's a huge achievement for our relationship. And as Mike said, the little-known Article 2 of the Security Treaty actually talks about economic cooperation, and so this is kind of the ultimate apex of that, in my view. Okay, so I have to stick my neck out a little bit and talk about, from a U.S. perspective, the prospects for TPP. I mean, again, I preface this always by saying I'm an optimist, and the optimistic position on TPP has been correct to date. As long as you did not pick a date. As long as you didn't say when this was going to happen, everything that was supposed to happen has basically happened in TPP. It's been signed. It was agreed and it was signed, and now it's it's in the process of ratification across the 12 members. I believe pretty firmly that TPP will be ratified by all 12 members. Again, I'm not going to predict a date, particularly here in the U.S. It is going to be a difficult debate. It already is. And I don't think I would put, a large amount of money on this prediction, but I do think that there is still a possibility that TPP will be ratified this year after the general election in November. I think that once that election is over, and depending how it ends, there will be a lot more clarity about who's going to be doing what in the administration and Congress, and I think it's possible that incentives could align very quickly to try to get TPP pushed through. And so I wouldn't rule that out. I'm not as confident in thinking this is going to happen, because one big problem is that without the groundwork being laid before the election, it's going to be, just as a practical matter, difficult to push through TPP through Congress. But I do think Congress can do whatever it wants. I mean, Article 1 sort of says Congress is the boss and can do whatever the American people want it to do. And so if they want to do it, I think they can. It's also possible that it's not going to happen, and it then becomes, I think, a 2018 proposition, because it's going to take at least a year for any new president, and that's assuming either presidential candidate actually wants to move this forward. It's going to take at least a year and a half before this thing can move forward. So I've stuck my neck out. I want to hear what others have to say, and feel free to take shots at that. I do think, and we were talking about this, Dr. Vo and I, yesterday, last night, that there is another reason for optimism about TPP, which is that despite the fact that it hasn't been ratified, it does seem to be affecting the ground reality in the region. I've heard this from several people now, that investors are making decisions on the basis of TPP. So if you're an investor and you're thinking about where to put the next dollar, I think you're more likely to put it in Vietnam today than you would be to put it in Indonesia, for example, because of TPP. So it is apparently, I mean, this is only anecdotal. I don't have any scientific evidence to prove this, but my sense from talking to many Asian friends is that it is having an impact already. As long as no one ever tears up TPP, and that's not impossible in our current political environment, but as long as it's still hanging out there as something that will ultimately be ratified, then it could actually have the desired effect on the ground. And so that's another reason for a little more hopefulness than the general gloominess here. Let me just say finally about One Belt, One Road. Very helpful explanation from Dr. Lee. I think every time I hear a presentation by a Chinese colleague about One Belt, One Road, I learn something more, because one of the challenges is it hasn't been very clearly, I think, laid out as an overall initiative or strategy. And I think I learned things about the connection. Again, I first thought, well, this is a very different thing from TPP, but to the extent OBOR is about trade liberalization or about smoothing value chains, that is certainly an important factor in promoting regional economic integration. And so I think this was a very helpful further clarification of an initiative that most people in Washington still don't really understand. I mean, I still have a number of questions about it, including exactly, what geographic scope it covers, so that there's been talk about 60 countries being part of OBOR, but I'm not sure what those 60 countries are. Questions about what institutions and other initiatives fit under OBOR, like the Silk Road Fund or the AIIB or the New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. Are these all part of One Belt, One Road? Not clear to me. I think what is a project that was underway before OBOR was announced, like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Does that count as an OBOR project, or is it something that's being rebranded as part of OBOR? There's still a question in my mind that I'd be interested in Dr. Lee's perspectives on. And then I would say beyond those questions, there are still the questions to the extent One Belt, One Road is about infrastructure investment. And it sounds like it's about a lot more than that. So that's, but clearly at its heart, a lot of it is about infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is really hard. If you came by metro to this conference, then you know what I'm talking about. And so even in advanced countries, it's a very difficult undertaking. It's expensive. It takes a long time. The returns are uncertain. Maintenance is hard. There are challenges of acquiring land, of dealing with political issues. I mean, there are 1,000 things that make infrastructure investment very challenging. And particularly in Asia, if you look at a map, and you look at some of the challenges of geography and topography, and then think about more deeply the challenges of governance, frankly. And, there's a lot of corruption across the Asia-Pacific, and infrastructure investment is very prone to corruption. So there are a lot of questions about that. Then there are all the issues about, if you build a road or a railroad, you have to move people, often have to move people out of the way. You have to consider environmental impact. These are all things that make infrastructure investment very challenging. And so I think it's great that there's focus on infrastructure and this new focus of conversation about infrastructure. Every country has a plan now. The U.S. still needs one, but Japan and Korea have their plans, and Turkey and India, and everyone is playing in this space. That's terrific. But I think when they hit the ground reality, literally, of trying to build stuff, it's going to be a lot more challenging. I was just in Kazakhstan a few weeks ago and on a very bumpy road to the Chinese border from Almaty, and it just reinforced on a lot of levels. I'm happy to talk more about that. Why this is going to be such a challenging undertaking. So I have plenty else to say, but I'll stop there, and I'd be interested in the discussion and further thoughts from the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Your point about competition is really an important one. The competition is good among different free trade endeavors and also within economies. Before you came to work in the NSC, President Bush gave a speech in Japan that I helped to write, and he was trying to support Prime Minister Koizumi's reforms, the essence of which was introducing more competition in the economy. So in the speech, he described that there was no word for competition in Japan, economic competition, until Fukuzawa Yukichi decided to use the word kyoso. And so we put that in the speech. And a little known fact, President Bush studied Japanese literature and haiku at Yale. So I asked him, you have the pronunciation of kyoso? He goes, I got it. And he goes out and he says, we all know what the key is to revitalizing the Japanese economy. Gyoza, which means dumplings. And there is actually something to that maybe, but fortunately there was a prepared text, so after a flutter of the confusion, everyone looked and saw what he meant. But competition is critical. Let me turn to Professor Lee, Matt, and follow up with your question. I had the same question. Is the OBOR, that's what we're calling it, is the OBOR, it's an umbrella, so it includes FTAs and infrastructure, but a lot of it is development projects. So let me ask you to respond to Matt's points or questions, but also ask, how will this work? Will there be, will these be loans from the Chinese government? Will they be grants? Will there be a competitive bidding process? So anything you can tell us, we'd be very interested about the governance of Belt and Road or OBOR. And maybe that's still being decided, but that's one of the big questions, I think, not only in the US, but around the world about OBOR. Yes, please.
Yes, OBOR have no comprehensive and strict rules like TPP. Its governance is premature. I think that the Chinese government is the searching for have no perfect the governance and architectures. Maybe by the implementing for several years, the OBOR's governments will be emerging. I have no exact governments. Yeah.
Well, can I ask? I have to turn yours off. Can I ask then, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank has coordinated with the Asia Development Bank and the World Bank. The people who run AIIB have looked for best practices. AIIB is still different from the World Bank or ADB, and its governance is still evolving, but there has been a very deliberate effort to coordinate and learn best practices from the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank. Do you think OBOR will reach out also for cooperation, coordination with World Bank, Asia Development Bank, or other international financial institutions and development agencies?
I think for the AIB, is related with OBOR, but is at the same time it's independent international financial institution. So its governance have to converging to the established international financial institutions.
Is that also true for OBOR? Can the same be said? Or is OBOR more of a national program that's independent, that's not being shaped by best practices or patterns in other institutions?
For one thing, the AIB serves as the OBOR connectivities, but it's not limited to the OBOR. For example, the members is beyond the OBOR members.
Right, I see. Thank you. I ask because there are a lot of, I think people in the audience may disagree. I think some of the initial uncertainty and skepticism about the AIIB has been reduced to some extent because of the engagement with international financial institutions, although there are still many questions. And OBOR is still a question mark for many countries. You make an excellent point. There's not enough infrastructure investment in the world. And also that OBOR and, say, TPP or RCEP are apples and oranges. They're different. They're somewhat different purposes. But I hope we can have more clarity and discussion about OBOR. Not that, international financial institutions should control it. It's China's money. But mainly for transparency and some confidence building. There's a whiff in Asia of infrastructure geopolitical competition. And with apologies for the obscure reference, it's a bit like 100 years ago when there were these railroad concessions in Manchuria. And the Europeans and the Russians and the Japanese all were championing different railroad projects, some north, some east-west, trying to dominate that region. The U.S. State Department briefly got involved and completely bungled it. This is 100 years ago. We were just not good then, and we're still not that good at, infrastructure as geopolitics. It's just not in our nature as a country. And I don't think this is like that necessarily, because, of course, China was weak and Manchuria was under contest. But in some of the regions of the world we're talking about, it could take on that flavor which we wouldn't want. That's very helpful. Thank you. We're going to ask more questions of the panel after our break. And also, I want to let you know what we plan to do so you can think about it and hopefully not flee. I'm going to ask the audience if you all think TPP is going to be ratified in the lame duck. And I want a more robust response than Ishige-san got on Japanese cuisine, because I know more than 30. Who likes Japanese cuisine? Okay. Wow, this side is really good. Who doesn't like Japanese cuisine? Okay. So I want to ask about the prospects for TPP, and then I want to ask questions that Ishige-san introduced of the audience. What's the sequencing? How does this work? Is it TPP, RCEP, FTAP, TTIP? I mean, so we'll ask the audience, and then for both of those, I want to ask the panel, and finally, I want to ask about geopolitics. And so we'll do those, and then we should have plenty of time for your questions to the panel as well. But for the next 15 minutes until 11 o'clock, there's coffee in the back, and we'll take a break. Thank you very much. Two of the speakers, Dr. Vo and Ota-san, a question. You both in different ways said that we have those who are outside TPP, and Ota-san mentioned Thailand, and Dr. Vo, you mentioned the need for, but also the challenges of ASEAN centrality. All of ASEAN is in RCEP, TPP is split. So the question I wanted to ask you both is this is very much a U.S. question. Does the U.S. need some economic framework for ASEAN? Some people said, well, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, everybody should be in TPP, but that was not practical in a high-end trade agreement that had to be ratified by the U.S. Congress. We used to have some, enterprise for ASEAN initiative and frameworks for economic engagement. But let me ask you both. I'll start with Dr. Vo. For the U.S., what do we need to do with ASEAN on economic relations? That's sort of the missing piece in all this architecture right now.
I think that's not easy question, but if you observe over the last 10 years, I think U.S. already changed the way, of engagement with the ASEAN country. Before, U.S. relation with ASEAN very much based on the bilateral, relationship. But over the last, as I mentioned, 7 years, more and more U.S. think ASEAN as a very important group to be dealing with. So that's why, as I understand, U.S. now, you have kind of ambassador side by side with the ASEAN Secretariat. And related to the TPP, I think U.S. understand that because of trade diversion effect. So together with the TPP, you can do that. U.S. need to be strengthen the cooperation in terms of economic development with those countries outside the TPP, say, with the Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. So that's why U.S. now, right now, U.S. have many program, development program with the Mekong, country. Like WEF, not a World Economic Forum, but water, energy, food, right? Program. I think that's a right way to do that. In the long term, I think that's about the TPP and RCEP conversions. And I think that's Vietnam try to share with other ASEAN countries. We learn a lot from TPP negotiation. We learn a lot from the way we have to implement the TPP commitments. So we can share that because, as I mentioned, AEC and RCEP should be, improved in the way they need to meet the new standard of trade investment. So that's a process, right? So in that way, we can strengthen the ASEAN centrality, ASEAN voice, and avoid any, conflicting kind of political or economic development we don't want to see. Right?
Yes. My view is, let me put it this way. There's no such a thing as ASEAN per se. This is just a collective, institution of 10 nations. But when it is useful for them, for each member state, they use it. If ASEAN is not useful, they don't use it. I mean, there's a secretariat of ASEAN located in Jakarta, but it's totally different from European Commission. So, what's important for the U.S. and Japan is to foster the centrality of ASEAN. I think, from my point of view, ASEAN has a red tag on it, saying that fragile, handle with care. It is fragile, so we cannot destroy it. But the U.S. airline and the carriers are not good at that, to handle with care, right? I think China is really good, delicate. I mean, they know. I think it's partially because of the way of the negotiation, for example, banging the table. And this is a way you have to abide by. It doesn't work. So what's important is to put yourself on the friend's shoes, and think with delicacy. I think such a small thing makes a big change. I think when it comes to Thailand, for example, they want to join TPP because there's a benefit, and particularly the rule of origin. is higher. The higher the rule of origin in TPP is, there is more discriminative. So that if you're outside of TPP, you get a disadvantage, so you have to be in there. So they cut their supply chain and value chains, they have to be in there. So to make the other countries and outside of TPP jealous on the insiders, so that's the key things, and also the soft touch. So the reason why the negotiation with Vietnam and the U.S. made such a progress is the U.S. has been very nice on Vietnam in a sense, right?
I don't know.
Not the Congress.
That's the way, yeah.
Matt, you want to defend United Airlines?
Yes, as long as I don't have to talk about catfish, which is an inside joke between Mike and me, a big Vietnamese-U.S. trade issue that we worked on some years ago. So, okay, remember that we had a real challenge with ASEAN until about 5 years ago, which was that we really couldn't enter into any serious type of arrangement like an FTA with this group because one of the 10 members was a country that was under sanction and it was just politically impossible to move forward on a serious sort of binding treaty-like negotiation. And yet, again, in the Bush administration, we did actually finally get progress or agreed on a trade and investment facilitation agreement, which is just a sort of framework for talking about trade and investment issues. So we were able to get that far, but really couldn't do much more than that until the Myanmar-Burma issue was changed, or the dynamic there changed. So it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that it's even been possible seriously to consider a deeper engagement of that kind. Meanwhile, TPP was launched, and I think that, as people have noted, only 4 members of ASEAN are in TPP, and only another 3 are in APEC. That leaves 3 that aren't even in APEC, so technically not even eligible for TPP. But as I said before, that's not really a serious issue. If Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia were ready to join TPP, there would be a way found to get them in. But the problem is they're not ready. And so really what this administration did, picking up on the last initiative, you mentioned the economic initiative for ASEAN, or whatever, Enterprise for ASEAN initiative, was created something with a bunch of E's also, the Enhanced Economic Engagement, or E3 initiative, which, if you look at it carefully, the press release that when it was released in something like 2011 or 12, it basically had a bunch of bullets, which were the chapters of TPP that ultimately we were going to be negotiating, and it was to try to kind of enhance capacity across all of ASEAN to help build a sort of ramp to get them more broadly up to the TPP standard. Frankly, E3 has not gone very far, very fast, and so because the same people are doing that and TPP negotiations, and so it was underwhelming. But I think there is a need for something new and different with ASEAN going forward. I don't think it's going to be an FTA at this point because TPP is now the basis of our engagement, but a more active way of getting a conversation going with all of ASEAN, the 10 members, about the high standards and rules of TPP, I think is important for the next administration to take up, and I would expect that it will be something that will be considered. There is East Asia, one more point. There's the East Asia Summit, which the U.S. joined, Secretary Clinton went in 2010, and then President Obama went in 2011. And that's an ASEAN-centered organization, ASEAN Plus 8. And that has an economic and trade agenda. The U.S. has chosen not to really participate in that. I think that probably should be reviewed. I think we should be engaged in the East Asia Summit's economic discussions. Not RCEP, that's probably a bridge too far. It is definitely a bridge too far. But in terms of some other forms of economic engagement, I think that's another platform.
I don't know. On the one hand, yes, There is some flexibility in some chapter for Vietnam under the TPP, like SOE, state-owned enterprises. And I have to say, Vietnam-EU FTA very much follow the template of the TPP. So we need only 2.5 years for negotiation. So if you look at the Vietnam-EU FTAs, so basically, follow the same issues like under the TPP, but on average, the level of commitment a little bit lower. But for the case of procurement, government procurement and SOE chapter, Vietnam-EU FTAs require higher, commitment than TPP for Vietnam. And whatever the case, I think the key thing is depends on Vietnam rather than, attitude, because principle, we have to follow the rules of game under the TPP. So for Vietnam, only since the Malaysia negotiation, I think 18 round, we become more offensive rather than defensive in terms of IPR, negotiation for IPR, SOE, and particular labor standard, require a lot of, the very top negotiation between Vietnam and US.
Good. All right, thank you. All right, let me ask the question for the audience. I'll give you 2 questions. The first question will be, will TPP be ratified in the lame duck session of the U.S. Congress, so before January, after November election, before January? And then the second one will be, if it isn't, will it be ratified in the first 2 years of the next administration? So, first question, please put your hands up high. The cameras can't see you. This will not be broadcast around the world. Only we can see you. And this is, of course, not scientific, but just to spark a conversation up here, let me ask the question to the audience. So, who believes that TPP will be ratified in the Congress in the lame duck session? Okay, what would you say, Matt? Is that about 7%? 10%. 10%? Yeah, dame decio. Off the record. Okay, don't post that. I promise them off the record. We don't want anyone to get fired from JAMA or anything. All right, if it doesn't pass in the lame duck session, who thinks that in the first 2 years of the next administration, of course, that's asking you to handicap who's going to win perhaps, but who thinks it's going to be ratified within the first 2 years of the next administration? That is more like 70%? Who believes that it will eventually be ratified without any timeline? That TPP will be finally somehow in the lame duck session, in the new administration, or maybe in a future administration, someday TPP will be ratified by the U.S. Congress. Well, everybody who already voted should vote, by the way. That's that one was not so scientific. I think we had a methodological flaw in the third question. Well, I don't know if, okay, we'll ask. Who thinks it will never be ratified by the U.S. Congress? Okay. So, all right, well, I just finished a book on the history of American foreign policy in Asia, and the punchline is the U.S. is highly inefficient but ultimately effective. And this kind of bears that out. We somehow, as Winston Churchill says, make the right choice after making all the wrong ones. All right, let me turn to the panel. Start with Matt, and we'll go this way. And I would like each of you to describe to me the opposition to TPP in your country. Is it serious? And can it be overcome? And let's start with Matt. So how serious is the opposition to TPP?
It's a complicated question, but I think there is obviously opposition to TPP, to trade agreements in the last, 10 to 20 years. There has been a strong opposition, particularly from the, this is not a partisan comment, this is just an analytical point, that from the Democratic side of Congress, where I think the members of Congress, it's often said that the members of Congress in the two parties, actually, are out of step with their own base, in the sense that the Democratic leadership has taken a position against trade broadly speaking, reflecting, the position of and again, oversimplified, but of labor unions who have taken positions against trade. In fact, polling shows, the Pew polls show that actually more Democrats than Republicans support trade, and that I think reflects the fact that the Democratic party is becoming sort of younger and more urbanized and more globalized, and so they sort of understand the importance of trade, but the party has still taken a position against. And on the other side, the Republican leadership has traditionally supported trade and trade agreements, and the voting has been pretty strongly pro-trade agreements in that 14-0 record that Mike expressed among Republican members of Congress. But clearly, as Donald Trump is showing, there is a part of the Republican Party that is very anxious about trade and globalization. And I think that part of the Republican base is more skeptical about trade, and that has to be overcome. So I think you have those sort of foundational forces, but then you just have this overlay of political debate where trade has become a kind of poster child for everything that's wrong in the economy and maybe beyond. And so I think in this environment, it's very hard even for supporters of trade to make the case. I would say even those who support trade, like me, I think definitely need to talk about trade in a different way. This debate has reflected the fact that I think we're talking about trade in the wrong way. We're saying it's great, and as an economist, I can show you charts that will prove that it is a good thing economically. It creates efficiency and benefits broadly the economy, but it does create losers, and there are transitional costs. And we tend to sort of say that the way I just said it, which is it's a good thing, but they're losers, but we'll take care of the losers. That's been the sort of traditional way that pro-trade people have talked about trade. I think this year's debate has shown that we have to talk about it differently. I think we have to address the concerns and anxieties of people who are displaced not only by trade, in fact, probably more by technological change, but they're blaming it on trade. We have to talk about their concerns and addressing them, and I think that's crossing both parties now. I think both Democrats and Republicans realize this and are starting to think about this differently, and then make the case for trade as a good thing for the broader economy and society. So I think that's going to be a lasting effect of this election cycle, even though there have been many pained trade debates in the last, as long as I've been doing this stuff since the 1980s. But I think that may be a lasting effect of this debate.
I wonder if you'd agree with this, Matt, that the opposition to TPP and trade in the Democratic Party is acute and intense, and it's mostly about labor unions and the progressive left on environment and issues like that. Whereas in the Republican Party, it's much more, among the rank and file members, it's much more diffuse and atmospheric and a general dislike of the government deciding anything, and in particular, something that exposes them to the world more. So it may be you need different solutions for each of these two constituencies, because one is very well informed and has very specific dislikes of trade. The other, it's more of an atmospheric thing among Republicans. And the poll earlier citing is the public, not the political leadership.
I mean, the first part of that's right, I think, and as it's often been said, the opposition to trade is very organized and vocal, and the support for trade is very diffuse and disorganized. So we all are able to benefit from our cheaper iPhones, and so we all know there are benefits, but we don't really stand up and fight for the right to get this cell phone. Whereas if you lose your job because of whatever factor, but you blame it on trade, then you tend to be more vocal. On the other side, I'm not so sure. I think that would have been the traditional analysis. I'm not sure now, because the Trump phenomenon is really tapping into something that may be deeper and more focused, but it's hard to tell yet.
Okay, Oto-san, in Japan, if we had this discussion 7 years ago, people would be saying, Japan can never have political constituencies for free trade, and of course the U.S. will, move this right through the Congress. And now it's the kind of, we've switched places. The LDP is going to put this forward. I'm told that the fall will be the TPP kokai, the TPP diet. But they did put it off, and you said because of the earthquake in Kumamoto, but I suspect there was more at play in the upper house election. So how serious is the opposition to TPP? Is it a real threat?
If you carefully look at what's going on the Japanese Congress diet, they're not talking about trade at all. They're talking about TPP, and they're using TPP as a card to attack the LDP.
The they is DPJ,
right.
DPJ still in English.
Right, and most of the
Communist Party and so forth.
Yeah, opposing. It's a majority of the opposing voice to TPP comes from both right wing and left wing. Okay, so right wing majority. I think the typical one is the agricultural sectors. I'm not talking about farmers. It's an agricultural cooperative association. So the individual farmers, if they are very keen in management and in innovation, so they jumped into the free trade and they want to make high value products and try to export more. But the people who want to have something to protect, it's better to be, status quo. So those are the people, and then agriculture. And the other one is the Medical Doctors Association, of course. So they are trying to keep their what they have now. But it's manageable, politically speaking. And the LDP was very skillfully managed it, and they gave a lot. Actually, the Japanese agricultural sector has been protected in the course of negotiation. They lost nothing, and they got even more gain from subsidiaries. So they maybe the winner. So they're very quiet. So nothing is happening in the diet. It's only just the political game. So it's a matter of time. So if the discussion goes smoothly once the new session starts, maybe in August or September, I think it doesn't take much time to ratify it. But the other thing we have to be careful in the Japanese public sector is something in common. In a right wing, left wing who is opposing to TPP, something in common is anti-American feeling. And they don't like to follow, the American manner, or they are pushing their demands, and they are so tired of what's going on in Capitol Hill and self-oriented manner of negotiation. They don't like it. So that creates a xenophobic sentiment among the people, something in common with the U.S., I think. It leads to populism and nationalism. It doesn't end up with the right way. So this is something I am concerned with.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Vo, how about in Vietnam? Who opposes TPP?
We have one-party system, right? So officially, another thing is that I don't know whether there's advantage of one-party system. Easy to go for negotiation, and Vietnam maybe become the first country who will approve and ratify the TPP, because we just have an election of the new parliament last month and in July. So next month, our government will submit a proposal and ask for ratification. So we hope in July, TPP will be ratified by the new parliament in Vietnam. So maybe first country. Yes, but there's surprisingly in Vietnam, according to many surveys, only about 30% of the business community, right? People, they know about the AEC and the TPP. But if you ask Vietnamese people, I believe that most people, in favor of integration, trade liberalization, and TPP, And even those, they can have, they suffer from negative impact of integration and TPP. That's a little bit surprised, because we understand that that's the only way to improve, as he mentioned, our competitiveness, our, how we can lay down the foundation to overcome middle income gap in the near future, how we push up the reform, how we push up the new way of development. But a little bit different from the case of WTO accession. 7 years ago, when we accessed WTO the year 2007, we were so enthusiastic, right, about that one. But later on, we have many problems, serious problems. Not just because of financial crisis, but because of mismanagement of macroeconomy, right? So integration and even TPP, that's just necessary condition, not sufficient condition for development. We need a domestic reform. We need understand the way how we can manage macroeconomy. Even the fact that our economy become more vulnerable to the external shock, right? When you open up, more open your economy. Two other concerns about TPP, because we learned from the WTO accession. Number one, there's how we can support the loser, right? Some sector, livestock, industry can negatively affected by the TPP very seriously. And those, they can lose the job. And the second one, how we can minimize the compliance cost, right? TPP, particularly for the TPP, behind the border regulation, you have to comply with that. They have to change the legal framework, And good news, Obama during the visit already promised U.S., right, will support Vietnam, that one, like EU support Vietnam in the case of Vietnam, EU, FTA, US AID, they will support Vietnam, to strengthen capability and enforcement of the TPP. Vietnam, easy to sign, have commitment. But the problem is Vietnam is a little bit different from American, Talking and doing, American, the same thing, Vietnam may be different thing. Okay, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So Dr. Lee, I think 3 or 4 years ago, another of your colleagues from China argued that TPP was a containment strategy to harm China's interests. And then 2 or 3 years ago, one of your colleagues, different colleague, argued that TPP is potentially good for China because, like the WTO accession in the 90s, it could be the kind of context for domestic reforms, like Vietnam, like Doi Moi reforms in Vietnam. So how does China, or how do you view TPP now? Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity for China? How is the debate?
Thank you. All of them speakers belong to the TPP members. Yeah. They can frankly talk about TPP opposition views. China is extended from TPP. If I say the opposition views, somebody can say me envy. So I talk about the China's opposition position on TPP. At present, China's position for TPP is called wait and see. First, China's position for accession to TPP depends on several factors. The first one is the evaluation results, TPP's exclusion effects on China. However, TPP is facing more and more challenge, uncertainty in the United States. None of the president candidates, both Trump and Hillary, supports the trade agreement. ICO made investigation. The results indicate a similar trend. For China, we can make the evaluation for at least 3 or 4 2 years after TPP entrance into force. The second factor is TPP's accession conditionality. As you know, China is a latecomer of TPP. So accession conditionality is imperative for China's decision. As a latecomer, China have to negotiate with every members. The members have their own motivations of accession to TPP. As a result, they will have a different policy for China's accession. For example, for Japan, accession to TPP is related with the Japan-United States alliance. For Vietnam, for accession to TPP is to decrease its dependence on Chinese market. For United States, as President Obama pointed out in Washington Post last month, the core objective for TPP is the rule-making pole between United States and China. The last section is whether the OBOR can promote China's opening up. In Chinese academic circle, promoting opening up is considered to be the most important goal for accession to TPP. You know, WTO is stalled, and the China's sustainable development and reform are based on the new round of all-round opening up. If we can achieve the goal by OBOR, I mean the promoting the opening up, the incentives of accession to TPP will decline. That's my personal view. Yeah.
The opposition will decline.
I'm no opposition for the TPP.
I see. But you're saying that if One Belt, One Road and these projects move forward, there will be less opposition to TPP. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. The only argument that works in the Hill, in the Congress, is the China argument right now, that if the U.S. doesn't pass TPP, China will write all the rules. It's the only argument that seems to be resonating among members of Congress, which is why the president keeps using it. It's not entirely logical, and I'm not convinced China is really eager to write the rules. I think One Belt, One Road, and even AIIB is, writing the rules for that is proving hard enough. But it is a domestic political argument. I don't think it's a strategic argument for the most part. All right, let me ask one more question to the audience, and that is Ishige-san's question. Historically, merging two multilateral trade agreements in the European case is tough. One of them folds into the other. The Peterson Institute studies have been quite interesting, showing that in aggregate, if you have both RCEP and TPP, you get quite a good amount of wealth creation. But as Ishige-san said, historically, one is the host and the other tends to dock. So the question I want to ask is, which is going to be the predominant driver of liberalization and integration? Is it going to be TPP over the next decade? Is it going to be TPP or is it going to be RCEP? So all those who think it's going to be TPP, please raise your hand. Okay. Matt, you're our statistician. What is that? 70%. And those who think RCEP? RCEP will be the driving integrator? About 2%. We did a survey a year and a half ago of about 1,000 elites, 2,000 elites in Asia, and we asked this question, was one of many questions, in the region. And among elites, the answer was about 60% TPP, and about 30 or so percent, there was some, don't answer, RCEP. So within Asia, there was more confidence in RCEP, but actually the result was that TPP won. We did this survey a few years ago, and the audience said RCEP. And one of the wire services wrote, CSIS study concludes RCEP will dominate over TPP, and Matt and I got angry calls from the U.S. Chair and the White House. So this is not a scientific survey. We can't judge how biased the audience is, but I think you reflect that. So let me ask you real quickly, just what's the sequence, Matt, that you see? Is it going to be, how does this work? Is it TPP, then RCEP, and then you've got FTAP and TTIP ultimately? How does this all, what's the sequence of play if this goes well?
I mean, they're different scenarios that people lay out. I personally think that merging, even if RCEP gets done, which I'm a little skeptical about, and I even hear this from, friends who are in the room, as long as India is part of, India is part of RCEP, I don't think it's going to be concluded. So that's just, I'm skeptical. But let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that it did get concluded in the next year or two. I still think it's going to be very difficult to merge these two agreements because they've got very different approaches to a lot of things. I mean, starting from the very dull, and don't need to bore people except trade lawyers about rules of origin and so forth. But I mean, there's a very different approach to liberalization and so forth. So I think it's going to be actually hard as a practical matter. I actually think what probably will happen is that the APEC members, and then maybe some others, will kind of go into another room, put a new sign on the door, let's say FTAAP, and then kind of start over again, and start moving towards a negotiation towards that end. But it'll have to be TPP plus because the U.S. and the other members of TPP, Japan and others, will not be able to accept a lower standard agreement. So it's going to have to be TPP plus, and that's going to be very difficult in practice for a lot of people to sign on to in the near term. So I think it's a long-term proposition. So I'm not holding my breath, but I think that's the direction. And like the Holy Grail, it may or may not exist, but it's a good thing to be pursuing. Well, some bad things happen along the way, but it's sort of setting it out there is not a bad thing. But I wouldn't hold my breath and expect it to be achieved soon.
Okay, let me open it up to the audience for some questions. We have microphones, right? And if you could briefly identify yourselves, questions are much preferred to speeches. And if you want to direct it to someone up here, please do. So, yes, right here in the middle table.
Hi, Dr. Wu. I'm Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have a question about, you already talked a bit, but I want to push a little further. It seems to be that Vietnam need to take sort of more drastic reform changes, compare if China were to join. So what do you think are the major challenges to bring Vietnam in compliance into this TPP? Thank you.
The first thing, I don't know whether that's easier or harder for Vietnam or China to join the TPP or compliant with the TPP rules of games. But as I mentioned, Vietnam now at the turning point in the sense we need a new way of reform and the new path of development. So we see the integration, especially TPP and domestic reform, institution reform, as there's two ways causality, can. And that's very good one. Look back a little bit. Vietnam are quite different from the case of China and Cambodia when we access to WTO. China and Cambodia changed the legal framework after they become WTO members. But that's experience a little bit not so not so good. So when we joined the WTO, U.S. and many other members of the WTO asked Vietnam to change the legal framework before the joining WTO. So Vietnam is the first, maybe developing country, have to change about 30 laws before the joining the WTO, right? Most very comprehensive legal framework. That's bad in the sense that, you know, we don't have enough capability. But that's very good kind of pressure for Vietnam, you know, you have to change everything before you join. And now the same thing, you know, if we say, okay, we need to reform, we understand that, but maybe process quite slow. But under the pressure from the international commitment, you know, with, particularly for the TPP, you need more transparent, more accountable, you know, on that kind of that. So you need to somehow push up, accelerate the process of reform. What are the key areas? That's the key area. We have the top negotiation with the US and other members of TPP. You know, labor standard, that's number one. Because, you know, we have one party system, we have one labor union, and now we need to allow the workers to have their right to choose their representative, right, under the TPP. Of course, we have transition period, 5 years. Or IPRs, Vietnam, like China, you know, enforcement of IPR is a very weak one. Another one is e-commerce, right? Data transaction, right? With the change of technology, you know, you have to change the mindset. And under the TPP, over the last 5 years, before conclusion, you know, we changed our mindset a lot about the data transaction, e-commerce, because of the new technology, you know, development, clouding, you know, big data on the thing, that one you have to change. So not say, you know. So I think TPP is not just per se as a rules of game. There's a learning process, you know, learning process. You know, you learn how you need to change, you know, the role of the state, business community in the new global context, new one, right? And that's, you know, where you need to adapt to the new reform. And that's another side very important for, you know, when you negotiate, when you join the WTO. And no secret, even now, you know, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, also in many ways invited to Vietnam to share the experience, how we join the TPP, because they also expressed the willingness to join the TPP.
We'll go here and then over to you. Let's over here to, is that Akimoto-san?
Satohiro Akimoto, Washington Inside. I have a question to Mr. Vo about the role of Japan and the United States in terms of ASEAN economic integration, because I think it hinges on Asia-Pacific economic integration. One thing that we have not been talking about today is development of economic corridor on the Mekong, connecting Mekong economies. I drove all the way from Bangkok, Poi Phet to Ho Chi Minh City last year, and also drove all the way from Doha across the countries to Myanmar. I saw increased volume of traffic, much easier border crossing, betterment of infrastructure, not just the hard one, but including mom and pop eateries to make it easier for drivers to drive long distance, and increase the Chinese investment in industrial park on the border. Japan played a major role in terms of helping economic corridors better in cooperation with regional governments. Is there any way that, or any role that the United States can play in terms of, you know, connecting economies on the Mekong countries on the ground, either independently from Japan or together with Japan? Because I think it hinges on, as I said, TPP and other bigger economic integration in the region, which Mr. Ota sort of mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, the first thing I would like to say, that's my personal view. Japan has some problem historic with the ASEAN country and even with Vietnam, but why the relationship between Japan and ASEAN and particularly Japan and Vietnam now improved a lot. We established a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan. One thing is not just Japan is an important trading partner and investor. That's for sure, that's very important. But for two reasons. Another two reasons. One is between ASEAN and Japan, and particularly between Vietnam and Japan, we have no any strategic contradiction or problem. So that's my personal view. The second, Japan very support the way of integration of ASEAN, right? Liberalization, connectivity, cooperation, right? And so Japan is the key investor to improve connectivity ASEAN. Japan, there's one player to drafting MPAC, Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity. 100 project, $100 billion you can mobilize from many resources. And now together with the AIIB, Japan also announced to have $110 billion to support the infrastructure development connectivity among the Mekong River country, right? What's the difference is, that's kind of ODA or, we can borrow from Japan, not like AIB. But different is Japan, emphasize on the high technology quality of infrastructure, right? Together with transparency, accountability. So the key thing is, Japan can play very comprehensive role in many ways to enhance ASEAN integration, to enhance ASEAN centrality, to enhance ASEAN integration. So Japan play very, very important role. But the only problem, right, because Japan, in terms of connectivity, Japan is more on the south-south corridor, right? China is a more north-south corridor. And so far, I have to say, not yet the engagement of the MPAC, Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity, with the, on the infrastructure development, China would like to have, even the OBOR, right? Not yet how to coordination with that, with the MPAC. No say about APEC. APEC in Bali 3 years ago also, approved the APEC connectivity very much based on the MPAC template, right? So I think coordination, that's the key. And that's related to the role of U.S. U.S. can have played the two kinds of role with the ASEAN, not just investment trading. Number one, World Bank also play very important role in project development with ASEAN country, right? Particularly for the Laos, CNMV, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam. And U.S. can have very big voice within the World Bank. The second, already I mentioned, because of a problem with ASEAN centrality, because of trade diversion effect, maybe with the TPP, particularly for the Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. So U.S. needs some kind of cooperation development aid for ASEAN as the whole group, and also for those countries, they can have suffer negatively from the TPP to strengthen their capability, and they have more resources for the development. So that's also a very good way, to have three things, trade, investment with ASEAN, ASEAN centrality, ASEAN solidarity, ASEAN common voice, and the last one, position of U.S. Very important. ASEAN recognize that in Asia Pacific region.
Dr. Vo, a quick clarification. First, for people who are not familiar with MPAC, with the map for planning ASEAN centrality, does it look, when you look at the map, is it north-south and east-west, south-south? Is it mostly south-south? What does it do? Briefly, what does it look like?
MPAC developed by the area, economic research for ASEAN and East Asia. That's funded basically for many members of ASEAN Plus 6, but basically funded by Japan, right? And side by side with ASEAN Secretariat. And under the ASEAN meeting summit in Hanoi, the year 2010, MPAC approved by the leaders, right? But at that time, many projects like One Band, Two Corridor, Pan Peipu development, and later on OBOB is not yet, incorporated under MPAC. But so there's been coordination. So MPAC basically about institutions and setting about the way we can mobilize resources and the project infrastructure for the ASEAN. Master plan for ASEAN connectivity and APEC connectivity plan, basically based on the template of the MPAC, people-to-people connectivity, institution to institution, and infrastructure, physical infrastructure, project development.
Thank you. Right. Thanks for your patience.
Stanley Kober. This is all based on the idea that Asia will be the growth market of the future, and that was mentioned. But today, Japanese 10-year government bond yields reached an all-time low, minus 1.63%. This suggests a lack of confidence in the future among investors in Japan. I understand that ordinary Japanese are buying safes to store cash. So could somebody explain this evident contradiction, it seems to me, between these projections for economic growth and these negative bond yields?
Well, I think it's a good time to talk about even if Abenomics has made a success or not. The public opinion has just started talking about the assessment of Mr. Abe's policy in economic policy. And it turned out that Abenomics is consisted of the three arrows. One is monetary policy, and the second one is fiscal stimulus, and the third one is reform. But what is missing is the reform. And a lot of disappointment is now spreading around the financial market and the investors. That is the case we are seeing. But when it comes to the robustness in the Southeast Asia, I am seeing a lot of activities. I live in Singapore myself. It's a lot of it's event is happening, and the trade is well, it's slowing down a little bit, but still, activity is there. And I'm home. When I go back to home in Tokyo, it's much quieter. So probably, if we go to Ho Chi Minh or the Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur, in a sense, Singapore, I think you will feel more confidence of the future of the economy in this region. But China is very difficult to judge at this moment. It's slowing down. It's 6.5%, around 5% maybe. But to reach that level of normalization, you call it, it takes a lot of time and a lot of friction might happen. Well, so as a whole, in the Asian regions, I still think that this can be the center of the economic growth of the world. But Japan, yes, our gentleman may be right. We have to look what's going to happen later this year.
And I mean, I assume, Matt, can you push your button? No, I assume there's no contradiction between TPP and reform, and that in Japan, not to the extent of Vietnam perhaps, but the TPP puts wind behind the sails of reform, which have slowed down. I mean, the third arrow is, I was in Japan last week, the third arrow is being described differently now.
Right.
It sounds more like infrastructure.
Well, yeah, I mean, the core essence of the third arrow of structural reform is still important, and there's still elements. I mean, I try to be optimistic again. I mean, TPP is a driver, but also, it's an achievement of the third arrow in a way, and it's helped accelerate some reforms like agricultural reform that was, again, unthinkable when we started doing this. And so, I'm still trying to give the benefit of the doubt. But the bigger question is that there is a growth challenge, certainly in Japan, and Japan in particular, because it has this just catastrophic demographic profile that with an aging population and a declining birth rate and declining population now. And that's just an enormous challenge together with its debt problem. So I think that especially among the more advanced countries in the region, there is a serious growth challenge. Even in the emerging countries, notably China, there is a growth challenge. In their case, still growing at whatever the actual rate is, but let's say somewhere between 4% and 6%. That's still better than we're doing, but much slower trajectory. And it's only going to be sustainable in China if they shift their economic model to one that's based more on domestic demand and consumption. And China's government knows that and is trying to move in that direction, but reform there is also very challenging. So about the only country that's really doing pretty well right now is India in the broader region, which is growing more like 7.5% to 8%. Whether that's sustainable or not is also another good question. But I think that there'll be shifts around the region in growth, but the region's still going to grow faster than the rest of the world, almost certainly, and still will be a source of great demand and great potential, especially with the emergence of this huge middle class in the region. But in the near term, in particular, there is a real growth challenge across the region. The JGB issue, I mean, that is partly Japan's fight against deflation and the low interest rate policy the Bank of Japan has pursued. In some ways, it's a sign of confidence. People are buying JGBs because they believe they will continue to have value. So I think there is a flight to safety as well factor in that, not a lack of confidence in that sense in the short term.
Thank you all. We toy with or do a little guesswork with the audience about the direction of these different negotiations and free trade agreements, and to some extent about the economies. But looking back over the decade we've been doing this, Ishige-san, past performance is no measure of future results, but for the most part, we've done pretty well, I think, anticipating where trade negotiation, institution building, economic development in the region is going, and our mega theme of the nature of integration. And I think one characteristic for the time we've been doing this together is that we're now talking in ways we really didn't a few years ago about how all these pieces fit together. I mean, your question, no one really asked a few years ago because no one could really visualize getting this far. And now we're asking, how does the landing, having taken off and now that we're in flight, what does the runway look like? How do we land all these planes? So I think the troubles in growth in Asia notwithstanding, some of the geopolitical challenges we didn't get to, and all the rest, so far, knock on wood, the trajectory is that we're generally talking about the integration of these different efforts into one regional architecture that's inclusive. That could come to an end because of events in the U.S. or the region or elsewhere in the world, or financial shocks or other black swans. But the trajectory generally for all the countries we're talking about and the businesses there is towards, in fits and starts, towards the kind of integration that's the theme of the the meeting. So thanks for shedding light on all this to all our panelists. What we're going to do next is take a break. There's lunch in the back and back where the coffee was, and you can grab some lunch and come back here. And at 12:30, Bruce Andrews, the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, is going to give us our keynote speech. Thank you very much. Bruce Andrews is the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, was confirmed in that position in July of 2014 after serving as Secretary Penny Pritzker's Chief of Staff since 2011. Before that, he worked in senior positions in the Senate and as Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Ford Motor Company. This is not a CSIS endorsement, but I will personally say I drove my Ford hybrid in this morning, plugged it into the CSIS garage, and one very happy and satisfied customer. But that's in your former life. Mr. Andrews has agreed to deliver some remarks, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. So please join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary Andrews.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Green, for that kind introduction. I can't promise that I can make sense of everything, but I will at least take a shot at it. I'm pleased to be here today with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and JETRO, an organization that we at the Commerce Department have had a long and productive relationship with for many years. I want to thank you, Mike, as well as Igishi-san, for all of the work that you've done to put together and host today's 11th iteration of the CSIS JETRO Forum. 56 years ago this Sunday, Japan recognized the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. President Eisenhower said that that treaty would establish an indestructible partnership between the United States and Japan. More than half of a century later, those principles remain the foundation of the modern U.S.-Japan alliance. It is a relationship built on our common commitments to security, democracy, and mutual economic benefit. Today, the commercial ties between the United States and Japan are at the core of our dynamic relationship. Japan is the United States' fourth largest trading partner. There is no greater evidence of our strong commercial ties than the fact that for most Americans, Japanese brands like Sony, like Toshiba, like Honda are household names. Japanese and American firms have together created some of the world's most iconic technologies. Japanese companies today employ tens of thousands of workers in the United States and invest billions of dollars in our economy. In fact, Japanese-sourced FDI in the United States rose in value to over $374 billion in 2014. That is why we are pleased to have Select USA and JETRO sign a new memorandum of intent to bolster our two-way economic cooperation and investment cooperation. And next week, during our third annual Select USA Summit, thousands of investors from around the world and a number from Japan will meet in Washington to explore new investment opportunities here in the U.S. and take advantage of our great business climate. Yet I want to spend the majority of my time today discussing what lies ahead. In particular, I want to note the challenges we face and the strong, decisive action we are taking along with our Japanese colleagues to shape the future that we hold so dear. We live in a world where new powers are rising, new markets are emerging, and new technologies are changing how we do business. In an interconnected world where both the United States and Japan have so much at stake, together our partnership allows us to successfully address these challenges. As two of the world's most advanced and innovative economies, our leadership in the global economy has never been more essential. But let's be clear, We have work to do. We must reinforce the economic architecture that has facilitated the success of our two economies and kept the world relatively safe for the last 7 decades. Failure to do so risks losing the ability to shape our economic futures. This is not an overstatement, it's just the truth. Fortunately, we have moved decisively to ensure that our nations remain at the forefront of the global economy by further integrating our economies. Late last year, the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community represented a major step in the right direction. President Obama signaled his commitment to greater economic integration by hosting the U.S.-ASEAN Summit in the United States for the first time this past February. My colleague, Secretary Pritzker, welcomed leaders from all 10 member countries to Sunnylands, California, for the summit. Our message was clear. The United States is devoted to economic engagement in Southeast Asia, one of the fastest growing regions and most dynamic economies in the world. ASEAN is home to 632 million consumers and a collective economy of more than $2.4 trillion. Two-way trade in goods and services reached $254 billion in 2014. To put that in perspective, that's a 55% increase since 2009. Our trade and investment relationship with ASEAN supports more than 500,000 jobs right here in the United States. Following the summit, we were pleased to launch the U.S.-ASEAN Connect, a new strategy to increase business-to-business collaboration between our two economies. 3 Connect centers in Jakarta, Singapore, and Bangkok will expand access to U.S. business information and insights. We also recommitted to better aligning our product standards. Incompatible standards raise the cost of doing business and add complications that make it more difficult to sell in different markets. At the Department of Commerce, we are leading efforts to improve compatibility between U.S. and ASEAN products, from medical technology to chemicals to electronics, by bringing our standards into greater alignment. Our efforts to create compatible standards will allow for greater collaboration between businesses and entrepreneurs from Southeast Asia and the United States. And of course, at the top of our administration's trade agenda remains the passage and enactment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which Japan remains a key ally. President Obama has made greater engagement with the Asia-Pacific a cornerstone of his foreign policy. TPP is at the center of that effort. Both the United States and Japan played leading roles in negotiating TPP, and Prime Minister Abe's bold leadership was vital to securing the high standards present in this agreement. Put simply, TPP will be a game changer, not only for the U.S.-Japan trade partnership, but for the entire region. Through TPP, we will combat corruption and strengthen the rule of law, improve enforcement of intellectual property rights, and improve working conditions in TPP countries through binding and enforceable obligations. Both the United States and Japan will benefit from this agreement. For the United States, this agreement eliminates 18,000 tariffs, many on day one. And for the first time, it establishes the rules of the road for a rapidly developing digital economy by supporting cross-border data flows and preventing harmful data localization policies. TPP facilitates the export of our goods and services, and it spreads our common values. The agreement is a huge leap forward for high standards on labor, the environment, public health, and many other priorities shared by the American and Japanese people. This is especially important at a time when not everyone in the region shares our commitment to high standards trade agreements. TPP is especially critical for small and medium-sized businesses looking to compete in our global economy. In both the United States and Japan, SMEs are a powerful force behind U.S. exports and a powerful engine for job growth. From 2009 to 2013, SME exports rose by over 52%, a rate more than 5% higher than large company exports. But far too often, high tariffs hold back businesses from exporting our goods and services to customers who want them. Take our agriculture industry, for example. In 2014, Japan imported over $13 billion in U.S. agricultural products. With a population of nearly 128 million and an affinity for U.S. products, Japan is an ideal market for U.S. agricultural exporters. But Japan's average tariff on agriculture is 14%, nearly 3 times higher than tariffs on the same products coming into the United States. It's clear that we can do better. TPP will eliminate most agricultural tariffs in Japan, opening the market to new trade and investment opportunities. This is a good opportunity for our two economies and our consumers who clamor for new products at more affordable prices. Still, we hear the voices of skepticism about trade. I want to address that clearly, which is something that we all must do if we want to change the perceptions around trade. Much of what they say is based on what happened with trade agreements in the past, but we must focus on the future. Yes, globalization is creating more competition for our companies. Yes, digitization is changing how we work. Yet all these forces will continue to transform the world, whether we embrace new trade agreements or reject them. The reality is that high-standard trade agreements are not responsible for these forces. Strong agreements like TPP are how we shape these forces to match our mutual economic strengths. TPP will advance our commercial interests, support greater trade and investment, and ultimately promote shared prosperity for the people of the United States, Japan, and all of our TPP partners. The middle class in the Asia-Pacific region is set to reach 3.2 billion people over the next 20 years. That's nearly 9 times larger than the entire U.S. population. The region is looking to us for leadership. The passage of TPP will demonstrate the strength of our partnership and the commitment of the United States to greater engagement in the Asia-Pacific and the world. So let's pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership and set the gold standard for trade in the Asia-Pacific and around the world. Let's strengthen the legacy of U.S.-Japan economic cooperation and stay true to our shared values. Together, let's usher in the 21st century phrase of our indestructible partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. We're very pleased to take questions from the audience now. We have some microphones. Let me open up. First, if I could, Mr. Secretary, one of the discussions this morning, of course, we talked about TPP, and I appreciate your quite robust statement of why this is in the interests of the United States and, of course, of our TPP partners. And you may get questions on that, I suspect. But let me ask about one other theme that came up this morning, which is about U.S. engagement in Asia. There was a lot of talk about China's Infrastructure Investment Bank, Belt and Road, Japan's effort to support the development of South-South infrastructure and transportation in Southeast Asia. And I tried to explain, we don't do that really in the U.S. We never have. So you mentioned some important elements of U.S.-ASEAN Connect and so forth, but what is the overall strategy for how we think about demonstrating American economic engagement? Because we're often asked, why can't you build huge infrastructure projects and so forth? And what's the answer to that? How do we do something else that is just as compelling?
Well, so let me start with, and just reiterating, that the United States is deeply committed to the Asia-Pacific region. I think one of the reasons you have seen President Obama make such a high priority of this is the fact that we view this as just critical to our future. It's a critically important region. It's, you watch the economic growth that's taking place, and you look to the future, and I think there's just so much opportunity for us working together. But as you point out, we do have a slightly different model in the United States. And I do think over the course of time that there is the opportunity to develop projects, not in the, showing up with a wallet or cash per se, but we do it a little bit differently in the United States, right? We have a different model. The private sector is much more engaged, the way the private sector does engage. So I think one is looking for how can U.S. companies get more engaged in the region, not just as business partners, but in terms of infrastructure projects, in terms of really engaging and helping to grow out some of these economies. I'll give you an example. I just took a trade mission to India in February with a group of smart cities companies. Just incredible. And there's going to be a huge amount of infrastructure spend in Asia over the next 20 years. And the opportunity for U.S. companies to participate in bringing world-class technologies, ideas, solutions to the region is incredibly important. Now, in terms of the financing, that does raise the need for us to continue to develop out the model because, in the United States, we do it a little bit differently, but I think there is the opportunity to explore public-private partnerships in a way that bring U.S. companies to the table and create financing models that, A, are not dependent necessarily on government money, which I think is really important because even in the growing countries of Asia, there is not, everybody is short on cash these days. There's not, anywhere where there's lots of excess funds, and that's one of the biggest limitations on infrastructure. So looking at new models, how we do it, but speaking to a lot of American companies are very committed to being in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think looking at the way they do business, the way they value, the way they grow jobs in the local economy, the way they invest in talent is something that I do think will help to build out the partnership. So it's not the same. It's a different model than showing up just with a checkbook and writing the check. But I think it's one that's got a great deal of potential, and it's somewhere that the United States, both as a government, but also from the private sector standpoint, have a great deal to add to what's going on in the region.
Thank you. Yes, sir. We have a microphone for you.
Hi, I'm Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have two sort of TPP-related questions. One is, when do you think President Obama is going to maybe switch rhetoric a little bit? Right now, he is saying we should make a rule, not China. The China, obviously, there was some view U.S. as sort of playing this geopolitical game. Would he be able to say more positively that we encourage China to join TPP at some times? The other is, of the 12 TPP members, there are some already recognize China's market economy status. The U.S. has not and probably will refuse to do so when China believes it's going to be enjoying the status by the end of the year. So what do you think this is going to play out in the bilateral trade? Thank you.
Sure. I'm happy to take the question. Two things. I think one is TPP, one of the really important points about TPP is it was written in a way that will be open to the future to countries who want to meet the high standards of TPP. And, I'll give an example. I think Vietnam deserves a great deal of credit for the forward-looking and the fact that there are going to be some not easy things that need to be done, but really important things that will help make Vietnam competitive for the future. When I was at APEC last year, the number of countries in the region who would like to join in the next round of TPP, there's a whole bunch of countries who are waiting for this first round to finish, who I think very much would like to be part of TPP. And I think, the good thing about the way the agreement was written is it was not meant to exclude anyone. It was meant to be open to countries who want to make the changes and do the things that will allow them to meet the high standards of TPP. And I think that is actually one of the strengths of it, because in the end here, what the goal has to be is to try to set not just the rules for TPP, but to go broader, right? And to continue to liberalize. We tried, obviously there's been a lot of effort at the WTO, but I think what we've recognized is that process is rather challenging. And so going bilateral is probably a little narrow, but going multilateral and allowing for agreements and then allow them to grow, it's actually a pretty good model that I think that will work well for the future. Second, you asked about market economy status. It is something that at any time China could actually ask the United States government to review. In any one of our cases for anti-dumping, the Chinese government could ask for a review of the market economy status. I guess I would ask by a show of hands, though, how many people in the room think that China is a market economy right now? And that a little bit, is something that it a little bit answers the question. And I think part of the challenge of the whole thing is we don't believe that the WTO accession requires automatically. And we also look at what's going on in certain industries, and we're all facing the challenge, right? Steel, aluminum, cement. There's a whole bunch of industries that we're having a major impact in the global market. So we'll continue to review the situation. We have a statute that we live under that was passed by the United States Congress, so we have to live under as a department. That's how we function. But at any time that China would like, they do have the ability to ask for a review of the market economy status, that's been done under law, and that's something. It's a discussion that I'm sure we'll be engaging on as the year goes along.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? We have the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which is half the U.S. government, it seems, enormous structure, and half the Chinese government. We have a bilateral investment treaty, a bit sort of moving along. How do you envision the future of, you spoke quite specifically about ASEAN and Japan. How do you think, beyond the immediate question of market economy status and so forth, how do you think the framework for engagement with China on economic issues is going to evolve?
Sure. Well, look, I think we view the China relationship as an incredibly important one, and one that we spend a great deal of time on. We've got the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. We have the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, or JCCT, that we do later in the year. And look, you're talking two of the world's leading economic powers. So what we do and how we engage each other is really important. I think the BIT discussion, we're looking forward to getting a new negative list. But I think that this can be an important part of not only opening up the Chinese economy, which I think making it more open, allowing investment, allowing greater investment, allowing more companies. I mean, there are a lot of U.S. companies that would like to participate in the Chinese economy at a greater level, but right now there are a lot of limitations that keep them from doing it. So I think it's actually a really important dialogue to have, and one that we want to continue, because I think we as a U.S. government believe bringing down barriers is a good thing for all of us, that it serves all of our interests. The more liberalized trade is, the more it's got to be fair trade, and it's got to be done in a way that is done in a way that is equitable for both sides. But we actually believe that this engagement is incredibly important, and we view those forums as a very valuable way to try to affect change in certain areas. And frankly, the dialogue itself is just important. Being able to have very frank, forthright discussions about the challenges and the problems we see between our two economies is something that is incredibly important.
Frank Giannuzzi, right over here, guys.
Thanks very much. I'm Frank Giannuzzi with the Mansfield Foundation. I'm always leery when people say dialogue itself is important. 15 years on Capitol Hill taught me that it's easy to denigrate talk shops. And if we're going to have 400 members of the U.S. government traveling to Beijing, I think we need to have more than dialogue. I think we need to have results. But the question I wanted to ask is about the AIIB and our theme of Asia-Pacific economic integration. The U.S. and Japan are now kind of outliers in our standoffish attitude about the AIIB. A lot of our European and other Asian partners and allies have joined the AIIB. Was it a mistake to stay out in the first place? And do you think that the United States and Japan, at this point in time, should rethink their opposition to AIIB, join it, have a voice in it, and help it be successful?
So look, I guess I would say two things. I do want to address the dialogue in and of itself is not valuable. having an opportunity, having a forum, though, to come in and to get deliverable. Because frankly, it's not valuable to any of us if we just sit around and talk and nothing comes out of it. So I completely agree, and I didn't mean to leave an impression that we don't believe deliverables and really having concrete actions come out of these dialogues. Because if it's just a bunch of talk, frankly, I completely agree with you that great, it's organized, we agree to meet twice a year, but we have to have we have to have real progress come out of it. To your question about AIB, I mean, look, AIB, I think the U.S. government position has been a little misunderstood to the extent that, having more money go into infrastructure in the region, I think is something we all agree is a good thing. And frankly, there are a number of, different multilateral fora that do this, right? The World Bank, the IMF, we've got there's a Japanese effort as well, and there's a whole bunch of different efforts. But I think the thing that we got to focus on is, from a U.S. government standpoint, part of it is wanting to see how AIB develops, right? Is it going to meet the high standards for environmental and other requirements that we put on other banks? How is it going to operate? Having more clarity on the governance. I mean, I think there were some really legitimate questions that were not answered at the time. And I don't think just joining, to your point of not having dialogues, just joining for the purposes of joining is actually not valuable, but understanding what the parameters are, how it's going to work, making sure that it does meet the high standards, because frankly, I think a whole bunch of the IMF and the World Bank are good examples who have spent a great deal of time building high standards that we need to just make sure those standards are met and understand how it's going to operate.
Oh,
absolutely,
okay.
please.
Just if I may follow up, I mean, part of the frustration that China felt was the inability to modify the World Bank, IMF governance structures. And I know we tried, but it's got blocked. And what can we do? I mean, I know this is outside of your remit, but you think about it all the time. Isn't it strongly in our collective interest, if we're trying to insist on high standards, that we bring China more directly into those international financial institutions? And wouldn't it have been a bit better for us to have been on the inside pushing for those higher standards rather than the outside saying, we'll wait until you see if you get them?
Well, so the good news is I will caveat with this is really a Treasury Department issue, not a Commerce Department issue. So I am always careful not to get out of my lane. And frankly, this is not something that I would claim a deep expertise in. But look, to your general point, there were reforms needed and frankly, getting through Congress. I know this was a high priority for the president. It was a high priority for Secretary Liu. It's something that we pursued quite aggressively, trying to get, to get fixed. And there is a frustration, right? When you're watching that at times we don't help ourselves with not being able to get things through Congress and really be able to take steps that are very important to the future, not only of the United States, but of our bilateral, multilateral relationship. So with that said, but I actually am not, I would defer to Treasury on it, but I do think there are legitimate concerns you want to understand before necessarily joining an organization. We face this all the time at the Commerce Department. With every engagement we do, you have to balance wanting to be part of the discussion with also, also making sure that you're not putting your name on something, you're not endorsing something that's not going to live up to the standards that you would want and that we've spent so much time getting the international financial institutions to live up to. And in the same way that I think TPP is valuable because it is a flexible agreement meant to be able to add future parties on, I do think AIB was left flexible in a way so that they could add future parties as well. So there will be time for it to prove itself and for some of the questions that I think were legitimately asked to be considered over the course of time. And, and I suspect it won't be in this administration, but I'm sure there will be a discussion that we have not heard the end of this discussion for the future. I think there's one more back here.
Thank you very much for taking time to talk to us. Sato Hiroyuki, Washington Insight. I have we have been witnessing interesting presidential race in the United States. It has actually unintended dangerous consequences in the mind of people in the capital of Asia. that maybe we may not be able to rely on the United States the way that we used to. Listening to the way that candidates are talking about free trade, the way that they are talking about fair burden sharing with allies, and so on and so forth. We have unscientific informal polling earlier this morning whether TPP is going to be approved in the lame duck session. And most people in this room thought that it may not be done. I think trade is very important in terms of the United States' commitment to Asia. As you said, do you have a concrete discussion going on in administration that you will get this done in a lame duck session? Do you have a robust plan to move forward with this once the race is over, so that there will be no speck of suspicion of the United States in terms of leadership in free trade in the mind of people in the capital of Asia? Thank you.
All right, well, I guess I would say a couple things. So I have to caveat with the good thing about being in the administration is we have a law called the Hatch Act, which means I can't comment on elections, which keeps me very safely out of political territory. But I guess I would say a couple things. One is, I don't think you should not question the United States' commitment to the region, and you should also not question United States leadership. Because I do think this is something that transcends party, it transcends administrations, and I think that you will see for the future, regardless of what happens with the political winds, I think you will see a strong commitment of the next administration, frankly, future administrations, to the Asia-Pacific region, to the U.S. continuing to be a leader. I have great faith in that. The U.S. political system, I will not comment on the presidential race, but I will say, look, political races in every country, and whatever level it is, leads to a lot of intense discussions and a lot of, thorny issues being discussed over the course of time. But what I do believe is the United States has a funny way of, we can have our disagreements, we can have our political disagreements, but then when it finishes, we get it right and we figure out, we move forward anyway. And that's frankly part of the resiliency of democracy that I love so much in this country, is we can, argue really tooth and nail about an issue, and frankly, we do it with Congress every day, but then we get past that to the fact of what do we need to do for the future, what's going to make our country the most secure, what's going to make the world a better place. And I really do have great faith in the commitment of the United States and our leadership that we'll continue to show with our great friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific region. TPP, it's a good question. I've spent a lot of time watching Capitol Hill pretty much my whole entire adult life. One of the things I learned a long time ago is never speak for the congressional leadership. But I do believe I would not write TPP off yet. I think in the same way I have faith in the system coming to the right conclusion, I also believe there is an incredible strength of economic logic to getting TPP done. It's incredibly important to our economy. The Peterson Institute has done a study that we'll lose about $95 billion a year by not getting this done. That's a very powerful number. I think when you really get past the rhetoric that often comes with trade agreements and you look at the facts about TPP, the TPP agreement is actually, it was a tough, there was a tough negotiation, and not every side got everything they wanted on every issue, but on balance, by far and away, it's a huge benefit to the American economy. Not just the American economy, I think the economy of all of our trading partners. I think it will grow the pie in a way that will benefit everybody involved, including American consumers, American workers. So I am hopeful still that we'll have a chance to have it considered. I don't think thinking to the next administration yet. Obviously that's a decision of the congressional leadership, but we're continuing to work. And if you've probably seen how much time and energy President Obama has spent talking about this. And there's still a very committed effort in the White House, in USTR, in the Commerce Department, across the administration that, until the Congress goes into adjournment, we're going to keep working on this because we believe not only should we get this done, but that we have to get this done. That this is too important to the future, not only of the United States, but the entire region. And so, I think we're looking forward to figuring out how to get this done.
Let me ask you, before we conclude, a question about the next administration. So you may still be in this job in 2 years, we don't know, but assuming you'll have a successor, set aside party and candidate and all that, the norm would be for that person to come in and meet with you, and you describe the office and describe how commerce works and where the coffee machine is and all that. And usually in those discussions, the outgoing secretary or deputy says, look, here's one thing I really hope you'll focus on, or build on that we didn't, that we started and didn't do everything we could have with. To the extent you can tell us,
sure.
What would that thing be for Asia? What can the next Secretary of Commerce do?
I've got a relatively long list at this point because I've been thinking about this for the last 3 months, actually. Look, there are a variety of things. So just to give you a macro sense, Penny and I have spent the last, probably 4 or 5 months starting to plan, and really even into last year, planning for how do we want to finish this administration, how do we want to leave the Commerce Department, and what do we leave next in priority. So we have a lot of different projects ongoing and things that I think will carry through to the next administration because how important they are. But I think if I were going to leave one thing for Asia, it would really be broadly the power of commercial diplomacy and the power of engagement on an economic level and how important that is to building relationships, to building bonds, to building an interconnected world that not only will make all our peoples more prosperous, but also, frankly, will really help to develop and hopefully turn the tension down on what are traditionally have been strategic and military issues. I think back to that the rule has been violated, but someone once told me previous to what happened in Ukraine, I guess it wasn't actually technically a war, so maybe you can count as that, but there's never been a war between two countries that have McDonald's. And there's a good reason for that, which is, and it sounds kind of funny. It sounds like, okay, that's a little bit of a crazy rule. But one of the things that is happening is as we have globalization, as, United States companies are investing in other countries, as Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese companies are investing in the United States, we're building links that I believe will really help to turn down the tensions that traditionally had come out in a strategic and a military way, because I believe those economic ties that we're building across Asia, and I think TPP and ASEAN are incredibly important foundations for that. We're putting down common roots together that will then lead to better ability to have our agreements solved, not through, the ways that unfortunately you look in the last century they were found or solved, but really looking forward of how do we make economics the centerpiece of our relationships so we're looking at our common good and our common prosperity, not necessarily focusing on things that cause tensions between us.
So, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I think it's fair to say everyone in this conference and room is rooting for you on TPP and on the broader agenda you described. And you didn't solve everything for us, but you gave us a really good capstone to the day. We started with Ishige-san on Japan's perspective, and this was the perfect way to conclude. So please join me in thanking the Secretary. Concludes our meeting. We'll look forward to seeing you next year when TPP, RCEP, and all of these are completed, and we can finally conclude our efforts. But thank you all for joining us today.